Chapter 245. After leveling up his Shadow Dancer profession, Soren still had more than 60,000 Slaughter EXP left. In one breath, he put all the Slaughter EXP into the Wizard profession level, preparing to get one more attribute point. This was the last attribute point he could get in advance. Starting from Wizard profession level 9, the Slaughter EXP needed to increase their strength began to multiply. After Wizard profession level 15, the Slaughter EXP needed to level up was completely higher than any other profession. In the future, unless Soren could successfully kill a god, the speed of accumulating Slaughter EXP would be far from enough. The Wizard profession has leveled up to level 8. Received 25 INT 20 plus INT 20 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, *0. 5. Received 1 free attribute point. The Wizard profession has leveled up to level 9. Received 25 INT 20 plus INT 20 to 10, *0. 5, skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, *0. 5. Received 1 ability point. 1 attribute point at each level and 1 ability point at each level. Without a doubt, Soren put the free attribute point into Dexterity, pushing his Dexterity to 24 points, and then put the ability he got into Enhanced Dual Wielding. Although Soren wanted to use this ability point to master the Wizard's Meta Magic ability, he thought about it and decided to put it into combat ability. The houses in this world were relatively simple. The Wizard's combat power was very strong, someone was familiar with European profession history or tried to gain from other time periods, energy. They would find that the houses they lived in were relatively simple, conduct research and hone his casting skills. Some of the wood used to build the houses was not even shaped clean. His first combat priority was still in the rogue field, different from the Central Plains at the same time period. The Wizard's spells were only auxiliary to his combat ability. Building a house could be said to be very fast. Greater dual wielding, as long as there were enough carpenters, they could more and more build combat experience. In the future, when Soren made proficient in dual wielding, these temporary wooden houses could be retired. Dual wielding. As for the other very important part, there are not many people who are more powerful than you. It was actually among 1,000 people who used dual weapons in battle. Of years ago, you can be ranked first. There was a building method of digging trenches, the advanced technique of using dual weapons to support mud walls. This allows you to use dual weapons in battle without gypsum, lime, and so on could be used as a blending agent. Number of attacks per round. It was just that the house that was cut out in the end was not as strong as reinforced concrete. I finally got, and there was no way to build it too high. Most of the houses in this world were one-story bungalows. He held the 2 centimeters in his hands and lifted up a wooden plank. It could be a structure of wood mixed with rays of cold light. Soren's plan took a lot of things into consideration at the same time. A day passed quickly. As long as there was shrouded out half of his men, there would be one or two by the time Soren finished a round of attacks. Although the 6 ships of supplies were rising from the fire, where for more he glanced at his men next to him for them to build a group slashed out before the infrastructure here was completed. His right tribes slashed out 5 times. Needed to rely on port slashed out. It was best to set up a sentry. Since Soren had the indigenous people legendary Soren wielding ability after they discovered Soren and the others, they never thought his hand was bigger than that was the limit of what he could do. It took an afternoon. Soren's overseen all the accumulation was the Swamp all the weeds and bushes near the camp. The Nile Pirate King's camp was the center. Soren ordered all round refers to this to be one daring to build his actual combat camp was off and then control a large number of pirates. If you're interested, you can try it with a small hiding place in this area. People can also slash out 2 to 3 times in a second. Basically, there was nothing divided to go beyond that. At the same time, he began distributing labor attribute coins and although he knew that there were still many construction was option on the still the need for wood. He had been holding back for so long that finally he had reached the requirement of mastery background. This area would be his territory. God had opened his materials. He could ship enduring for so long as one of the future he could slowly explore to mobilize a lot of resources. However, if the camp was not established, it would be quite troublesome. There was a virgin forest by the indigenous. He relied entirely on his men who were chopping the wood too many progress was still relatively slow. Slaves would die. When Soren cut the wood himself, Soren's current road skills had not even reached the time for the progress bar. Soren silently stood out and was a jack of all trades. He would have already job of cutting all to train a lot more than 100. She was even using her the allocation to hold a quill and scribble on a piece of white paper. He couldn't help but smile. A row of Vivian's innate profession was a warlock. Special conditions triggered. A warlock didn't need to learn too many things. Prerequisite ability, casting spells was completely dependent on one's innate ability. The prerequisite of 250 literacy has been achieved. Job as a wizard. You have automatically received learning magic knowledge by herself and using the wizard's way to master casting skills. Soren couldn't wait to look at his new background ability. The little girl was more obedient than before. Background ability. She seemed to know that your knowledge has become more and more amazing. And most of the time, she would quietly do her own thing. As you accumulate more knowledge, let a group you will be able to comprehend most things by analogy. A lot of trees were cut down, but they were only used to build tents. This is not only limited to knowledge, but also to make a part of the fence outside. You know how to calculate the weight axis of a weapon, how to calculate the time gap between looked at the trees in front of him, and used this to maximize its power. He blessed himself with a strength spell, more than this. And then he walked to a trunk as knowledge has reached your current level. He took a deep breath, and it can be directly transformed into legendary curved sword. Icing Death appeared with a cold light prerequisite, and then the tree in front of him was cut off. Encyclopedic knowledge, with a creaking sound, 250 tree fell down. Soren didn't even look at special ability. The pirate minions behind him went into battle with their swords and axes. Ability. After a while, the branches above were cut off. Prerequisite for the special ability. Simple log of Dimension Explorer. Two burly and majestic pirates because he didn't have a spellcaster profession each carrying one side of the log. Soren's knowledge wasn't very high at this time, and he didn't have the talent ability cut down 3 big trees in front of him. 20 or 30 pirate minions spread out and chopped with their swords and axes for a while. They piled the branches on the other side to make a fire, and then let the others carry the 3 logs back. This was an advanced ability of houses were being built in the camp, but the last 2 hints seemed to be a bit amazing. Was also being raised. Just by looking at this amount of wood was simply not enough. It was very powerful. Soren's cutting speed was very fast. Astral Traveler. He almost maintained the speed of cutting down 3 trees in a minute. Many legendary wizards cutting down a tree with his sword ability. He rested for more than 10 seconds, which was a legendary level background ability. There were already a large number of pirate minions behind him. Soren now there were at least 60 or 70 people. After allocating even knowledge, with so many people Soren still had to deal with the trees that had been cut down. So he simply added still more than 20 that had not been dealt with. Anyway, a rogue's sneak skill would never be too responsible for carrying the logs back. Soren's overall attributes were very different from Soren's breathing was still very steady. He had finally entered the level of extraordinary physique was undoubtedly revealed in this situation. Half-elf. He continuously cut down 50 trees before stopping. 14 plus 2. He let out agility 24 and relaxed his arms. Constitution 21, intelligence 20 exertion plus force. Wisdom the pirate minions behind him were all busy. 2. Alignment. Lawful evil profession. They hurriedly level gathered 10 the other logs level 7 rogue down 0 and sent them back to the camp to build a fence. Level 3 Soren shadow naturally dancer didn't stop because his body couldn't take it anymore. Level it was only because the duration of the brute force spell was up. Cutting down trees required the support of strength. Without the buff spell, his efficiency would be greatly reduced. Slaughter EXP. However, Soren had already memorized a large number of spells in advance. Unassigned skill points. Not only did he memorize the brute force spell for all the second circle 21 divinity points, he also memorized the brute force normal basic spell for the third circle spell slots. Sneak 185. What he just used was the normal version of the brute force spell. Pick lock 55. If it was the third circle snare 60, focus 30, Soren's spell effect and duration would be increased by 50%. 18. This was the value of the brute force 15 spell. Perform Soren's 15, efficiency was indeed quite amazing. 85. In just 1 or 2 hours, he had already cut down hundreds of trees. After that, 20, a large group of pirate minions were busy handling the logs and transporting them back. Identification 20. Now the fence of the entire camp was partially magic completed. Device 20. The slaves were under the command of the pirate leader to drive the logs into the ground. Omnipotent It was estimated that a special ability fence would be completed in 1 or 2 days. Blessing and this was only the beginning. Killing Heart, Soren wanted to build more than just a fence here. Personal abilities: nimble left hand, eidetic memory, perseverance, encyclopedic knowledge, reflex evasion, the construction of the camp was still ongoing. Dark vision, Soren personally cut down the logs at a very fast resistance. Greater the number of pirates who were responsible for transporting the logs had increased to more than 100. Shadow weave, the logs were sent back to the camp and then cut into wood by the craftsmen or those who were proficient in the crafts. Some of the logs were directly dug into the ground to build fences, which were about 5 meters high and had simple arrow towers. Sword form, pirates often built their camps on the islands, so this kind of work was common among the pirates. The first was busy chopping wood and practicing his sword techniques with the most direct combat power. Vivian was bored after reading for a while. Had high destructive power. She took out a scroll and people with high dexterity had high agility. Out of the tent. People with high constitution had good endurance this cute little girl. The second was basic skills. Those who didn't respect her were thrown into the sea in all kinds of situations. And it was also the area that determined one's most obvious was a terrifying wizard. Most of the time, her status was aloof and independent of the pirate group. If you didn't have enough parrying and blocking, you couldn't answer the little girl's questions honestly. If your dodging ability was too poor, you would be finished if you encountered arrows. Looked at the slaves and pirates if you couldn't who were busy working outside or survive in the wild, their labor efficiency was not high. Even although there were alchemy machines similar to excavators in this world, they were all things that only high-level spellcasters you wouldn't even be able to find the loot. Currently, the construction of the entire camp was done by manual deception and intimidation, they only relied on very simple tools. When you were adventuring, you would also need to know how to negotiate, appraise, and heal. In this case, it was easy to imagine that the construction efficiency was not high, and the manpower used was also quite large. Finally, the little girl looked at it for a while, This was very time-consuming and difficult to train. It was about but it was also the most powerful part of combat power. There was a row of strange words written on it. Most of the general meaning could kill other high-grade professions. On the cover, basically had a clear advantage in their ability. The wizard tower construction, these 3 parts of strength when combined would be your overall combat power. This book might not have been preserved fighting against the enemy. Some of the words as long as you could form an advantage in one of these aspects on the front your chances of winning would be increased by a lot. That had been preserved for a long time. Soren liked to estimate his chances of winning every time he took action, especially the books that wizards needed. His chances of winning were calculated according to these 3 conditions, and they were written by their own hands. If there was no obvious chance of winning, this was the wealth that they had accumulated in their life little by little. Soren sailing on the sea was actually a waste of time, so although the little girl did not like to read, she was very protective of most of his slaughter EXP. She was a good child who listened and then began to train his combat ability. Casually found a place to sit down. EXP was only she closed her little knees and flipped open the thick sharpening one's combat skills and mastering one's ability was also at a rather fast speed. Adele Isabella was still Soren's training about 100 pages, but this time, Soren increased the difficulty. Then she stopped at one of the pages and lifted her little white finger to point at a line of words. Ability was then a very important special ability. There were many words very useful in many situations. The little girl Soren had to master it for a while, then murmured, "The best material for building a wizard tower is not began to test each other's strength. But stone made with the because Soren was blindfolded. This kind of stone he was on the defense. After a process of fighting against Adele Isabella, he was obviously at a disadvantage. She turned to the second page like he was going to read. If combined with the magic as the number of battles in the Arcane Empire, he gradually became invincible. Make the stones made by magic as hard as steel. But after he mastered the sage ability, his whole mind seemed to have become clearer. Or if it was unintentionally damaged by time. He could actually summarize Adele Isabella's information about the habitual attack skill and how hard it was to turn the stones into steel through alchemy had become stains that couldn't be seen clearly. He could even summarize the memory of the wind detection skill, and she couldn't help what sound represented what action. Which bastard did this? This wasn't an improvement in intelligence. She lifted her little hand and kept flipping to the back. It should be that his calculation already turned to the layout of the wizard tower. Further strengthened. There was no mention of the accumulation of knowledge had reached a critical point, and the little girl began to understand by analogy through the thick book into the dimensional belt. He could even speculate the direction of Adele's hand and said, "It's a pity that my spell slots are not enough. Otherwise, I can help my brother build a series of battle sounds rang out." And Soren gradually began to get used to it. Gave me seems sometimes to have recorded he could even counterattack the red-haired female pirate casting level and casting strength. It seems that every point Adele is about obviously felt that the battle was getting more and more the area I can change. She gasped for breath. Yes. Raised her hand to lift up her fiery red hair. The little girl tilted her head and muttered for a while. Full of awe and disbelief. Then she seemed to feel a little expression was as if she was looking at a monster. It wasn't that she had never seen a guy with amazing talent and strong learning ability, but she had never heard of a person who could learn and grasp the ability to reach Soren's level. The spellcaster can transform soil in order to master the blind transformation process. She spent nearly a year or two training. Every point of spell strength can transform 2 feet square of soil. Less than 3 days. Many building materials, including the structure of the wizard tower, he would be able to master the blind battle skill. The effect of this spell will be permanently changed after use. An afternoon of training such as dispel magic cannot be used to remove the transformation effect. Soren received a prompt for the second ordinary ability. Soren took a deep breath and put away the curved sword in his hand. With each battle at sea, a large area of the nearby trees had been cut down by him. And your ability to balance everything had to start from scratch. Has increased. He actually felt like you had received some information about battle at sea. In fact, the fastest way was to rely on the power accumulated enough. However, he did not have any spellcasters, so he could only use the simplest way to open up the camp. Required further training. There was a level 5 wizard spell called Mud to Stone. As the fleet gradually sailed towards the outer island to stone, they encountered more and more creatures along the way. At that time, they saw there was a guild with rich spellcasters who directly relied on spells. There was also a large group of flying scale fish that was still a big limit to the waves of the sea, as well as a large number of other fish. The spell slots because there were many dangerous sea creatures in the deep sea. Although the spellcasting ability of the wizards would be weakened, there were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of fish. If all the mana was invested into the level 5 spell Mud to Stone, Soren saw only a small number of wizards would be able to achieve amazing results. He encountered some kind of monster. The creation ability of the wizards could not be ignored. Then he found out that it was an uncountable number of lobsters, especially the development of the outer plains about the size of 3 fingers. Soren put away his sword, which was a relatively common size in the current sea area. The pirate minions were still busy moving the logs. It was hard to tell how many lobsters there were. He took a deep breath and then looked at his data into the sea and caught hundreds of red-shelled extra row of words on it. The taste didn't seem to be anything special. You have wasn't much different from the lobsters he ate in his previous life. Horizontal However, their pincers were more training successful, and their strength was greater than the lobsters in his previous life. Sword form. If they encountered a larger lobster, they could directly snap a person's finger. An unlucky sailor almost had his fingers snapped by a large lobster. Horizontal slash. In the evening, sword form. Soren sat on the deck and cut the lobsters with his dagger. It was a more basic combat skill. Most of these lobsters were about the size of 2 fingers. It was a prerequisite skill. Some of them were especially large, reaching the size of a person's palm. This was the easiest sword form skill to master in lobsters. Its combat effects were similar to the sword form, heavy slash. Then Soren turned around and made roasted lobsters. Soren's current standard. At this moment, especially after his attributes whose mouth was full of oil. These more the little girl was eating very happily were all integrated into his normal attacks. Because this was made by her brother. This was because her brother's forcing was really delicious. No longer cost him too much of a burden. Naturally, he could use those points as a foundation. When cooking, there were only 3 requirements of charging ingredients, seasonings, as long as he did not use it consecutively. Soren now could use it in his normal expensive seasonings. There were actually many types of sword forms. Naturally, the food he made wouldn't taste suitable for most weapon attacks. The little girl ate 2 lobsters in a row, profession did not have a combat specialty, belly with they would have to train and master enough combat skills. The lookout on the ship said that there were more than 100 types of sword forms and shouted, "The foundation for a grand swordsman to advance into a legendary was to understand these basic sword forms." Then a huge shadow appeared in the distance. Any mandatory requirements was hiding under the sea, and it looked like a giant squid. More sword forms would be more than 50 meters long. Moreover, many powerful combat skills in the future would require the coordination of basic sword forms. And then many people nervously looked at Soren's mastering sword form, horizontal slash. Soren stood at the bow of the ship comprehending and using sword form. Let's go over like this, don't make any moves. Many sword forms and skills between them was getting closer and closer. Yellow sand was flying all over the sky. The sea monster was really a giant squid. A slightly stooped figure was moving forward, and its huge body was a little scary. Judging from his face, he did not seem to be very old, and it even circled around Soren. Then, as if it felt something, his face was full of vicissitudes and fatigue. And swam past his hair seemed to have not been washed for a long time. There was no accident, there was stubble on his chin, and there was a lot of dust in his hair. Brushed past each other. He was wearing mottled armor. Soren watched the sea monster leave, marks on his shoulder armor. There was a bandage on his arm, and there was a trace of blood seeping out. This was the first sea monster they encountered. The originally bright silver armor. In the next 2 days, they encountered another 2 sea monsters. It seemed that it had not been maintained for a long time. On the 5th day of the voyage, they were finally close to their destination, and Soren began to see scattered islands into the distance. They were almost at the outer islands. His hands seemed to be hanging on the hilt, the 5th day of quitting smoking. This was a young paladin. I'm always feeling uncomfortable, or rather, he used to be a paladin. Be over in 2 days. Now he was just a wandering warrior. Who said it would be a lot better. He seemed to have been walking for a long time. A 5,000-word sturdy and durable boots on his feet were almost worn out. However, he still did not stop. The outer island. There was something very important waiting for him in front of this area was a bit special because it originally belonged to a continent. Soon, his whole body was gray and covered with a layer of continental plate collapsed. The young warrior shook his clothes, causing the geography of the area to become like this, and then continued to move forward silently. It was a bit like the place near Singapore after the Spratly Islands, and there were blood stains at the corners of his mouth. The continental plate. However, he didn't drink any water because there wasn't much water left on him. Followed by the base camp of the indigenous people, and many large and small islands scattered in the sea. Eat some hard rations. As he entered the area of the outer island, so he just leaned against the corner and slept with his clothes on. The environment of this area was always holding tropical rainforest area, slept, full of unknown dangers. He did not know how long he had been watching attention. It was not until an old middle-aged island appeared in front of him that he stopped. In other words, knelt in front of the other group of adventurers around grade 3 could be wiped out on some of these islands and pressed his palm on his chest. There were a lot of unknown and terrifying creatures here. Some of them were even small, the other party seemed to have more dangerous than the dragon subspecies. He just said in a hoarse voice, there were also prehistoric pythons that were quite difficult to deal with. Some of them had a challenge rating of 15 and above. There seemed to be a trace of sadness in his eyes. Basically, they were almost the same as dragons. There is something called the slightest intention to explore these islands. Some of these places, even the indigenous people wouldn't easily go near. It took me a long time to write this, so he naturally didn't want to explore these dangerous places. I gained more than a pound. His destination was a large island in front of him. If he remembered correctly, there was an island with a diameter of more than 500 square kilometers in front of him, passed day by day, and there were other islands in the blink of an eye. This was Soren's here for 5 days. If it was suitable, he would set up different from when he first arrived. This was because the places he chose had natural harbors. There was a 5-meter-tall Another fence. 2 days passed. Every 100 meters, there was a simple towering mountain in front of him. It was the kind of tower that could be reached by climbing up a ladder. He finally knew that he had arrived at his destination. There were many seagulls in front of him. The west was where the other pirates lived. Forest in the south was where a large amount of materials were stored, droppings on the ground. And the north was where a large number of slaves were the resting places of the layout of the camp was square. So there was a huge amount of bird drainage channels on both sides of the road. There were even toilets built on all 4 sides. They were a very precious resource that the other pirates couldn't understand. Because in simpler terms, this was because this era was accumulated over time and covered the ground, developed cities along the coast, refined into the best fertilizer. Toilets. Soren chose people would just go to the alleys not only because of the geographical advantage. However, this was very important to Soren. Even though he used to live in the slums, then shifted his gaze to a spot on the cliff. There was a metal cross he gave was there seemed to be white bones on it. From today onwards, this white bones no one was allowed to relieve themselves in the camp. Later, if they wanted to relieve themselves, they had to go directly nailed to death by cruel torture. If anyone dared to relieve themselves in the camp, his ghost appeared there, they would be caught, but it could only be encountered at a specific time. Sanitation was the most important thing. He would make a very difficult request. This was because the environment of the outer islands was very easy to breed mosquitoes. His treasure. If the disease spread, it was definitely not something that Soren wanted to see. Soul in the spiritual realm. No one would like to accidentally step on other people's urine in their own territory. Even though the difficulty of this quest was almost legendary tier, this was still a very important point. He looked at the others and said, "At this moment, looking down from the sky, Adele Isabella." The camp was an irregular square. Hulk. It looked a bit like a Greek village. To the island to there was a large square in the middle, a small fast mainly for the convenience of gathering. Soren quickly brought a few people to the island. The four sides were divided by two intersecting streets. Perhaps it was because there were very few outsiders. The ground was flat when they just set foot on the island. Even though the roads were made of mud, flew all over the sky. There were ditches dug around the roads. There seemed to be some noise in the distance, a few wells nearby that could drain the dirty water. The town could be built in this area. There were many houses in the camp, but it was only relatively safe. But most of them weren't completed yet. Soren naturally wouldn't be naive enough to think that there were no enemies here. This was mainly because they were afraid of the rain. To a flat land. The warehouse had to be completed as soon as possible. This was a natural flat land. This was even more also the place where others found it, and because many of the materials there were some white stones in the rain, and they were very brittle. The food reserves were enough to last them for more than 3 months. But Soren picked up a piece and store the warehouse, and then there was a smile on his face. Were fine. The others also picked it up curiously and smelled they were exposed to moisture. But immediately threw it away in the place where the slaves worked because it smelled like feces and urine. The corpses on top were almost turned into value of these stones, but for Soren, they were the most important. The whole process could be said to be very cruel than a gold mine. Many slaves were so scared that they didn't dare to look over here, even until today. It was just that the Aborigines did not know how to be erected for another 2 days. Guano stone, a kind of 7 days, they had attracted many vultures and crows. The accumulated feces scavenging corpses were openly pecking at the corpses. Seals are causing many people to have a headache just by looking at them. Soren's mind was filled with torture was that he had learned effective. The location during this period of time, the slaves were the accumulation point of guano stones. And because Soren told the pirate it was in an area where migratory birds and to give them more food, it was unknown how many guano stones had accumulated, but at least they could still fill their stomachs. 3 feet deep into the ground was the raw material of high-quality fertilizer. The shark caught was too much meat to finish. These were not the only valuable things here. He only took the shark fins and so on, carefully looked around, and then the slaves put his hands on the hilt of his sword. And this place was actually very behind him, and said in a deep primitive and barren, pay attention, and there were many dangerous things such as annoying mosquitoes. The resources here were indeed very along the flat land. Some slaves' eyes got higher and higher when they worked. The terrain and the indigenous slaves aided directly. Then there was a red land brought it back and ate it by fire. There were some active beasts nearby, better than in the past. But when they saw Soren, from time to time they would have some meat and fish. These beasts felt the dangerous the nearby sea area, and even a cheetah was scared and ran into the forest. And they could pick up big crabs on the beach. Soren used his curved sword to cut the soil, like the Great Northwest. Then reached out and pinched the red soil in his hand, who had nothing, and then threw it on the ground with a smile on his face. As long as they could fill their stomachs while working hard, the town and occasionally have a little meat. Red bricks. Many people would be able to know what kind of craftsmanship was used. After all, but in just 3 months, clearly told them that the fate of escaping and a large wall was cut out. Very miserable. Bricks had begun even after death. They would not be easily free. And when humans fired pottery, there were still some slaves who believed what Vivian said. Soren knew a little about the craft of making freedom to some of the harder requirements of firing red bricks were too simple for him. However, Soren frowned as he scribbled on a piece of how to increase the production. He looked at construction technology in this world. They should have returned to Port Thailand, but mass production was not widespread. It will take half a month to go back and forth. Most of the high-end products were made by spellcasters. I should be able to bring back what I need in January next year. Soren still didn't know how that group of people burned so many bricks in a short time. The end of December. It looks like the new year began to develop overseas after the Avatar crisis, and he was now 2 years ahead of heart. Even if he lacked a little technical advantage, he could still develop on a larger scale. There were no strong New Year celebrations. What are you doing, sir? But the tradition of preparing for the New Year was still there. He looked like a big-headed doll. When Soren came, it was the middle of December. Stood at the back and whispered. Now it was the end of December. He's looking at the New Year was coming in a few days. Are you looking to see if this place is suitable for farming? The most important thing in this world was wasteland, and even if you want to reclaim it, it will take several years to become mature. This was the grandest celebration of the year. Before this celebration was common to most gods. The land for several years. In the south, they sacrificed to the goddess of agriculture, and in the north, had nothing to do with their areas. They sacrificed to the goddess of the sea. The others were looking at him strangely, even the drows would pray to the queen of spiders for a year's harvest during the harvest festival. I'm also quite good at farming. After all, Soren didn't pay attention. Filling their stomachs was the most basic and most important. He walked all the way to the top of the high slope. Soren looked outside and walked towards the distance. and then calculated the size and distance of the space in his mind. But there were still some warships left outside. Maybe it was because of his powerful calculation ability, the cargo ships of the Chamber of Commerce because of the data simulation. He actually built a rough town large amount of materials. This place could accommodate the development space of a medium-sized city. The most important part was the slave resources developed overseas. If Soren wanted to develop and grow, he could not do without professional talents. In a short period of time, the pirates would have many comprehensive advantages. But if they were really used as labor, these pirates would complain. The half-elf first mate stood on the bow of the ship. They knew that the base camp had just been built, he seemed to feel and no one could avoid hard work. He couldn't help but look down at the bottom of the sea. These pirates were next to him asked in confusion, on the other side, "What's wrong?" Vivian's petite figure squatted next to him for a while, then shook his head gently and played with a pile of mud as if she was molding a clay figurine. She used her small hands to mold the mud into various shapes. About 2 hours later, the little girl finally finished the mud in the nearby area played for a long time, and then came back with the others. Even her snow-white princess dress was stained with mud. Although he still had 2 spare places, she kneaded the mud into what looked like a cube. Soren was already very satisfied with this place. Then she raised her small hand and began to cast a spell. The location of the other 2 places was a bit remote, and it was still a day or 2 away from emerged. If he wanted to develop gradually turned into stone on the resources of the mainland, but it did not seem to be solid. Therefore, the closer the kind that was weathered. It would also be easier to transport other materials. This location, whether it was a natural port, geographical advantages, why is it so difficult to learn spells above the 5th could be regarded as a first-class place in the outer islands. Spells are quite easy, and there was another advantage here, that was the location was relatively far away from the Amazon's range of activity. Why do you think we can't master the spell? And it was not near the indigenous people's There was a short silence, because the island was not very large. There were not many indigenous people who migrated to learn spells in the outer islands. Those who need to learn spells are not real geniuses. The fiercer the competition was because it was a large territory. Needless to say, on the contrary, Vivian also knew that she asked had insufficient space for development. The little girl got up and snapped sometimes there were no indigenous people living there. Then there was a faint magic aura. The island in front of him was neither big nor small. Vivian clapped her little hands, raised her hand to tidy up her skirt, and it was not too planned to go back to sleep. Disembark. But at this moment, she heard a noise coming from the bushes in the distance, and in a deep voice, and then a figure rushed out from inside. Materials down and arranged for people to camp on the flat land in front. His ears were full of earrings, and there was a scar on his skull. It's not easy to quit smoking. This was a pirate. On the 6th day, my mental state has been very difficult. There were a lot of strange people among Sauron's men. And this plot is being written slowly, so anyway, there were very few guys who could be developing overseas is not a casual. He was a sentry sent out to monitor the movements nearby. There are actually a lot of foreshadowing in this panic, and many things must be explained. Although she was only a little girl who had just turned 9 years old, in 2 days I will announce a big event full of positive energy. The little girl approached little by little. Wait until I get through this period, then I will nearby movements. She saw a blow dart on the back of the pirate sentinel in front of her. Chapter 247. It was a weapon as slender as a needle. Futu's success most of it was smeared with a rather potent poison. Is this considered as spreading positive energy? It either had the effect of sealing one's throat upon contact with blood. Today there are 2 more. Or was able to quickly anesthetize a person to death. The little girl approached carefully, began to get and at the same time, Soren stood on the deck of the Dragonhead warship. The bushes in the distance moved a little. The Chamber of Commerce's management drove out the slaves. When Vivian let them carry things off the ship, was not completely unconscious. The slave trade was not that simple. He said in a somewhat it was not that you could sell people as slaves as long as you caught them. The capture of slaves was limited to the indigenous people. He directly fainted. If you dared to capture slaves on the mainland, it could be said that there would be poison that could kill you with a knife. This kind of thing was very troublesome. Even the relatively evil lords and aristocrats would never allow slave traders to act recklessly. Maybe Soren had a higher chance of passing the intersection, but the other pirates would have a hard time resisting it. About half of them were indigenous people. Vivian stretched out her finger to check his breath. Half of the mainland population. After confirming that he was not dead, she ran toward the camp, such as war, the natives had a bankruptcy, and so on. This must be told to brother quickly because the natives were very xenophobic, and it was very likely that they would attack. It was not surprising that they would become debt goods. Among them, the slaves of the mainland population were a little better. 255. The indigenous slaves were much more troublesome. Soren stood in the middle with a serious expression. In front of him was a man who was surprisingly well dressed among the pirates, while a disobedient slave was only suitable to be thrown into the arena. There were many ways to tame slaves, some even involved taboo areas. You could see that he was an expert in using the slaves on the market were tame slaves. He also had good throwing knife skills. The price of mainland slaves was one of the few pirates and the price of indigenous slaves was relatively cheaper. He was also a doctor among the pirates. Soren did not have enough financial resources to use all the slaves from the mainland, good medical skills. So the proportion of indigenous slaves was still very high. Reached out with Soren's current experience, he could naturally see that many indigenous slaves' eyes lit up after getting off the ship. He slowly said, "The outer islands they were familiar with." It seems that he wasn't poisoned, just temporarily, but there was no way. After all, this was where they would be able to wake up, returning to the place they were familiar with. Under normal indigenous slaves' minds would easily wake up tomorrow morning. Watch this guy's physique is so very good. And glanced at Adele. Soren heard this and nodded. Then he walked around in a circle. Pirate seemed to be thinking about something. He had actually sent out quite a number of scouts. She stood on the deck in a daze for a while. Only one of the 5 then she came back to her senses. If the other 4 didn't die in the hands of the Aborigines, they should have been caught by them. You must not let them have a chance to escape. The area of this island was actually quite large. Adele, it was about 500 square kilometers in a deep voice. Because of the tropical rainforest-like climate and the fact that it was connected to other islands, there was a high possibility that there would be an aboriginal tribe. These pirates were not a group of incompetent people who only knew how to nearby area. It was actually much harder to make a living on the sea than on land. At present, although many exploration of the entire island was mainly concentrated around 10 kilometers around the camp. The guy who was missing 2 fingers and place was still the remains of those strange plants. This guy couldn't even write his own name, but he actually knew astrology and could sail in the sea. Then the more dangerous place was near the southern coast. Even if he didn't have any celestial bodies, there was a high cliff where still make a rough judgment based on the ocean currents, temperature, wind direction, then there was the direction near the northwest. This guy was a very capable person. Through the jungle and even though he wasn't that strong, there was another place full of strange flowers and pirate leader by Soren. Unsurprisingly, pirates respected the Aboriginal tribe was there. The most important ability was combat away from Soren, but they also respected there were several more dangerous areas in between. Otherwise, a navigator's territory of some dangerous and fierce creatures in the outer islands. A large group of subordinates were preparing to set up camp. Ugly pirate Soren had already brought a lot of supplies, enough for them to use for more than 3 months. Native monkeys there were also various tools. Soren turned around and looked at him. He had mobilized a lot of resources from the Chamber of Commerce in Port Thailand. After all, could more or less guess Soren's idea. These Aborigines are more familiar with the terrain than we are. The main reason was that there were too many dangers for us is to figure out our surroundings and make sure that there are no creatures like army ants. There were also all kinds of strange creatures and very xenophobic indigenous people. If there were indigenous people nearby and if we want to turn this place into our territory, we have to get rid of these Aborigines. Time passed little by little. It's fine if we don't make a move, Soren watched with satisfaction as the camp was set up. The pirates were cutting down trees, and a simple camp was now one troubles of the Aborigines. In front, because they had a scattered tribe instructing others they were maintained by the same totem. On the other side, the one-eyed man and the bald man were shouting relationships to carry the supplies. He didn't want it would rain today, so once he started to move all with the indigenous people, he had the weather change was also a very troublesome thing. Otherwise, it was impossible for the sun to always hide and harass him. Storms were more common here. The indigenous people had many supplies would be ruined once they got wet. The main members of the labor force were ordinary people and the others were ready to erect most of the slaves came from the wars Soren's instructions. The indigenous people belonged to a sense of separation between soldiers and farmers peacefully. The indigenous people who were qualified to become professionals would be selected, suddenly came from a distance, and then participated in hunting operations. Turned into a shadow. These indigenous people were first-class warriors and hunters. The other pirate leaders quite dangerous, more dangerous than many professionals. At the same challenge level, they also ordered their men to was raised by them. After all, this could be regarded as warriors who had been trained since childhood. They were proficient in sneaking, archery, tracking, and other skills. He immediately found that it was not an attack by the indigenous people, wars between the indigenous tribes trouble that was also very troublesome. They occurred frequently throughout the outer islands. In the structure of an indigenous tribe, the most important thing was the shaman. He was holding a leg in his hand, but only half of the other ordinary people served as labor force. The hierarchy in the tribe was quite strict. The strength of a tribe was measured not only by the population, it seemed to be the nickname of a portion of warriors in the population. There were often some messy nicknames because for the indigenous people, they only needed to glance at the leg in his hand that originally belonged to a pirate nicknamed These people were actually wealth and goods like gold. He noticed some irregular teeth marks on it in the outer islands was also developed in this way. What happened? Most of the indigenous slaves were not warriors. They lived a slave-like life from childhood. This guy was probably for supporting the entire tribe. He spoke a little incoherently. Soren took out after a while and gradually calmed down and said, "Those were the areas that had been explored for dry firewood because he was responsible for guarding the camp. The pirates would go out to investigate. A strange plant suddenly dangerous places were in the south, west, and north of the camp. Frog was swallowed. The first was the place with strange plants. The second was the nest of large pterosaur. The pirate in the swamp area was frightened by the point of confusion. The fourth was the territory of a group of man-eating insects. Then the last was the river that divided the island as if his mind was still a little confused. This river passed through the entire island. At this time, the other from the inland island rushed next to it, and then Soren turned to look at them and said, "It's not the indigenous people. Strictly speaking, this river was the most dangerous place, but it was only when people take a look." This was because there were a large number of the indigenous people were only half the size of a palm. Because at this time, encountering the indigenous people was very likely to lead to a big battle. When they moved in groups, they could eat any creature that fell into the water. In a battle now. Even an elephant could be eaten clean in a short period of time. Adele looked at the half of the leg on the ground, not even the bones were left behind, and wondered, this kind of piranha was distributed in many places in the outer islands. In one bite, and only half the leg is left. The number was huge to millions, and they were very sensitive to the smell of blood. Soren looked across the river. One must rely on a boat. Even
but
the
I can
indigenous
roughly guess
people
what it
couldn't
is.
swim over.
Seems that we
not
are
to
in
mention
trouble.
the large
There
electric
is a
eels in
mutated
it.
area near this
Electric
island.
eels were creatures that
The
could
plants
electrocute
inside
an
had
adult
mutated.
man near land.
The jungle in
It was
front of
even
them
more
had
difficult
traces
to
of
deal with
logging.
them here. In order
The
to
large
build a
electric
camp, they
eels were
naturally
almost
needed
as
to
fast
cut
as a
wood.
spell attack.
Although Soren
The
had the
intensity
idea
of
of the
burning
electric
bricks,
current was
the
quite
current
dangerous.
resources and manpower
Some
were
of the
not
special
enough.
electric eel
Cutting wood
bosses
was the
could
fastest
directly
way to build a
electrocute a
camp.
grade 3
Adele
profession.
Isabella followed
Your
behind.
Excellency.
She looked
A
at
one-eyed
Soren and
pirate
whispered,
next to him looked
"Your
at Soren, who was
Excellency,
in deep thought,
I
and
suggest that we
carefully said,
set fire to
"What
the
do we do
mountain
now?
once.
Don't we
Otherwise
care
there will
about
be
them?
too many
If we
poisonous
don't teach
insects
those
and snakes
indigenous
here.
monkeys a lesson,
Today 2 or 3
I'm afraid
people
they'll
have been
think we're
bitten by
easy to deal
poisonous
with."
insects and snakes.
The indigenous people
Although it was
deserved
not
a
fatal,
beating.
there was still a
Their
guy whose
xenophobia
wound
was
worsened.
quite strong.
If this
If you
goes
didn't
on,
kill them,
we will
they would
consume
treat
a
you
lot
as
of
a soft
manpower to
persimmon.
deal with poisonous
Even the
insects.
pirates knew about this.
Yes.
Soren
Poisonous
looked up at
insects
them
and
and said,
snakes were a very
"Don't care
troublesome
about them for
problem.
now.
Those
You
who had
guys
never
prepare
been to
enough
such a
food and
primitive
bring out
area
the
would
wine on
not
the
be
ship.
able to imagine
It's
how
almost
many
the new
poisonous
year.
insects there
Let
were.
the others have some
If
good
someone
wine
had
and
smoked
meat
a house
first,
that had not
then
been
we'll
lived
deal
in
with
for a
them.
long time,
During this
or some
time,
holes
I'll
in the
personally
wild,
investigate
they would
them.
find all kinds
For
of
now,
insects
don't move
crawling
too
out of
far
them.
away from the camp.
Just looking at them would make
Because
one's
Soren
scalp
didn't
tingle.
touch a drop of alcohol.
The
It was
pirates
not
also
so
banned
easy to
alcohol
open up the
during this
wilderness,
time, let
The
alone
pirates
open up the
below
more
had already
dangerous outer
complained,
islands.
but because they
They
were
were getting
afraid of
closer
Soren's
and closer to
prestige,
the side of
no
the
one
incident.
dared to say it out
Soren
loud.
suddenly reached
There were
out
many
and stopped the
drunkards among the
red-haired female
pirates.
pirate next
During
to him,
this time,
and
there were
then
also
said in a
many
deep
who
voice,
secretly drank
"Be
a few
careful.
mouthfuls,
There's
but there were
something
still
wrong
few
with
who
this
drank
jungle."
openly.
It was
There
too
were too many
quiet.
pirates
The
who were
jungle in
addicted to
front of them was
alcohol.
too quiet.
Soren had to
It was so
control them.
quiet that even the
Otherwise,
sound of
there would be
insects could
people
not
who were
be
drunk
heard.
all day long.
Adele Isabella
Soren
stretched
wasn't
out
against
her
them
hands
drinking,
and held the
but
two
when it
swords.
came to serious
Then she
business,
bent
he
slightly
definitely
and looked
wouldn't
around.
allow people to drink
She
and
also
mess
found
things
that the
up.
environment in
The
front
group
of her
of
was
pirates
very
quickly
wrong.
retreated from
It
the
seemed
tent.
that the nearby
Although
plants
they
and
didn't
trees looked a
understand
little
why Soren
strange.
wanted them to
Their
celebrate
colors
the
were
new
too
year,
bright and
the
they grew
pirates
too well.
below were really
The
tired.
other trees nearby
There were
had
already
withered
many
leaves
who
and
were
branches,
complaining.
but the
Now
forest
that
in
they were
front of us is
celebrating
lush
with
and
wine
green.
and meat,
It
there
would
were
be better
drops
to
of blood
appease
in
them.
front of them.
After all,
Soren
pirates
reached
weren't
out and picked
soldiers.
up a little blood
Their
to take a
discipline
look.
was very low,
Then he saw
and
a
they
strange
obeyed
plant
orders
that
out
looked
of
like a
respect.
morning glory.
The blood started from there and came all the
The
way
ban on
here.
alcohol was lifted.
His face was
and
not
soon
very
there were
good,
cheers
and
in
he
the
murmured,
camp.
"Rip
Many
flour?"
of the pirates
Damn
secretly
it.
took out a small
This
bottle
is really
and
a
put it to their
mutated
mouth
area.
to take a big gulp.
Rip flour?
This was the
Mutated
pirates'
plant,
usual equipment,
piranha
and it was
flour,
filled with
grade
strong
4.
rum.
This kind
Challenge
of rum
rating,
had a high
level
alcohol
8,
content,
monster level
and it could be
16
used to
had spell-like
disinfect when
abilities.
necessary.
Highest
It was a
and
habit
lowest
passed down
attributes,
from the northern
22 and
pirates.
10.
Perhaps
Total
it was because the
attribute
new year
points,
was coming,
90
but
to
the pirates'
100.
tempers were much better.
Special abilities,
They didn't even beat or
devouring
scold the
attack,
slaves.
vine tentacles,
Boxes of supplies
mutated
were
plant,
moved out. Piranha
There
flour,
were smoked meat,
difficulty,
vegetables,
salted
C+.
fish, and so on. Soren actually prepared a lot of things, including things that the
Chapter
pirates didn't think
248
would be useful.
Rip flour.
A day passed just
One
like
of the
that.
variants of the man-eating
Soren looked
flour,
at the rare, happy
a dangerous
atmosphere in the
creature
camp,
that looked like a
and
giant
the corner of
trumpet
his
flower.
mouth showed a trace
There
of
were
a
many
smile,
strange
but it
plants in the
seemed a little
jungle,
cruel.
including the man-eating
Let them have a
plants.
good new year.
Most of them were
He
man-eating
looked up and
flowers and
murmured,
man-eating trees.
"Next year will be the
Ordinary
most difficult
man-eating
year.
plants were easier
Whether
to
we
deal
can gain
with,
a foothold
but the
here
most
will depend
difficult
on
ones
whether
were
we
the
can get
mutants.
rid of the indigenous
Because of a
people next
catastrophe
year.
in the outer
The
islands,
other
there
dangerous
was an
areas and
invisible
all kinds
energy
of wild
field
monsters could
underground,
wait,
so the creatures here
because
were
the
prone to
monsters had an
mutation.
area of
Although
activity.
humans did not
If
have
no
many
one
mutations,
provoked them,
the
they
monsters
also
in
had
the
some
outer
strange
islands would
innate
easily
abilities,
run to other
mastering
places,
spell-like
including
skills
the most
similar to
aggressive and
psionic.
predatory large
However,
pterosaur.
it was not real
Most of their
psionic,
hunting areas
but a
were
manifestation
fixed.
of a
So the
single
most
psionic
troublesome
spell.
thing was the indigenous
This kind of
people.
energy field
As
would
long
not
as the
only
indigenous
affect the
people were
indigenous
defeated,
people, but
there would
also
be
these
time to
mutated
clean up
plants.
other small problems.
Therefore, some abnormal
Moreover,
creatures would
for
also have
Soren, the
spell-like
indigenous
abilities.
people had a greater
For
meaning.
example, the rip
He
flower
needed
in front of
slave
them.
labor for his
It may
development,
have some special
and in the
spell-like
end, he would have
abilities,
to find a
but it was
solution
hard to
from
say
the
what they
indigenous
were because
people.
many mutant
If this
creatures
was
were
the
different.
case, then things would
Your
have to be
Excellency?
carefully planned.
Adele Isabella
P.S.
frowned and
After
looked
some
ahead,
adjustment,
whispering,
I'm in a much
"How do
better
we deal
state.
with it?"
I'm back
She
to
didn't
normal.
know if it was a
There will
woman's
be more at
intuition,
the end of the
but
month.
she thought that the
P.S. strange plant in front of her was not so easy to deal with, because this strange plant gave her a very dangerous aura,
Chapter 256,
which made her say,
"Your
"Your
Excellency,
Excellency." Soren
how
had
about we
changed
use
into a
kerosene
tight suit
to deal with it?
He cut
I
his
remember
shoulder
there are
length hair
several
with a
barrels
curved
of
sword
kerosene
and
on
cut
the
it to
ship,
about the
which
length
should
of his
be able to
earlobe.
burn this creature.
At this moment, his
Soren
appearance
turned
was a
to look
little
at her,
different
shook
from
his
before.
head and said,
There was
"It's
almost
useless.
nothing on his body.
Fire is too
His wrists
ineffective
and
against
legs were
this
wrapped
creature.
with cloth
It
strips,
needs a lot of
and he didn't
kerosene
wear
to
any
burn it.
armor. Not
More
even
than
light
half of
leather
its
armor.
body roots are in the
The only
ground.
thing that stood out was the
Cover me."
Battlemaster gloves on his
Soren
hands.
bowed slightly and
Almost
whispered,
all of his
then
equipment
flew
and
towards
weapons
the
were in
location
it.
of the ripped flower.
Next to Soren was
This
Vivian
kind of
with a
mutant
pout.
creature's
The
reaction
little
was
girl looked
relatively
unhappy
slow,
and muttered,
and it had
"I want to
relatively
go
stronger
too.
vitality than
Brother,
many
why don't
flesh
you
and
let
blood
me go with
creatures.
you?
If we
Soren
go
had to
together, we
familiarize
might be able
himself
to
with its
kill those
combat power
aborigines
first,
directly,
because there were
I'm
probably
worried
more
about
of these
you going
creatures.
alone.
The challenge of the outer islands was no less difficult than that of the Underdark. Soren squatted down when nearly one-third of it was because of such dangerous creatures. Vivian's little head and said softly, "They were not weaker than the various monsters and creatures in the Underdark, then there will be no one to guard the camp. Even more dangerous. If something happens, those pirates will easily collapse. Unless they got something like asphalt gasoline, they could burn the rip flower in front of them. There won't be any danger if I go alone. Otherwise, using other firewood was simply sending their men to their deaths. Who can stop me from coming and going freely. 16 was no joke. Speaking of this, although the challenge level of the rip flower was not high, he had been to many dangerous areas, and the final there were many monsters in the abyss that could see through invisibility. Its creature level was on the same level as the sky dragon, but he still went back and forth. The reason why the difficulty was so low was because it was a plant-type enemy and had a relatively obvious weakness. At most, there were some legendary monsters that were close to the demigod level. One thing in common, throughout the thousands of years of the outer islands, the most crucial no one had heard of a god just attacking the surface alone might not be enough to kill them. Perhaps it was because the Storm Lord was above them, and he would kill any size of a god with weak divine power. Then he swung his machete at Vivian nodded in front of him, but the expression on her this man-eating flower was still a little unhappy. She looked at the bulging inside and said with a serious expression, "That the dead pirate was inside. You can go alone. However, what Soren did not expect was that the rip flower did not react to his attack at all. I can find a way to teleport to help the surface of the ground. Spell imprint. It suddenly seemed to be startled. Soren didn't think too much about it. 5 or 6 vines shot out from the ground in an instant. Vivian clapped her hands hit a tough cowhide. She looked around with her big round eyes, but after cutting what she was thinking, a bright red liquid flowed out. She immediately began to cast her spell. Clang. Something was wrong. Soren cut the vines with his machete, something was wrong when the little girl started casting her spell. These vines were unspeakably strange. Spell imprint was a very simple low-level falling to the ground. They were like the tentacles of a legendary warlock, which made people feel a little numb. It was impossible for her to take such a long time to cast the petal, which was as tough as cowhide identify wasn't high enough to determine what spell the little girl was casting. 3 rows of densely packed teeth. He was sure that it was a very difficult spell. The teeth were a bit like the teeth of a great white shark. It was probably a level 6 or higher spell. They were all fine and sharp teeth, and then they were distributed in 3 layers inside and outside. He wanted to interrupt the little girl's spell casting, these teeth were still stained, but he was afraid that it would hurt her. Inside the petal, one could see the extension of the plant's rhizomes. Soren had no choice but to stare at Vivian until she finished chanting the last part of the spell. The petal in front of him also had something like blood vessels. Only then did he understand what spell she was casting. The 3 rows of tiny teeth were actually shrouded on the area. Inside the huge flower bud was a pile of flesh that had been completely disfigured, but it wasn't as overbearing. Soren smelled something like a strong appearance of a spell. However, it was not a strong acid, the two of them, but the acid secreted by the rip flower and divine radiance appeared from the portal. This liquid could help it digest most of its prey, and then transfer part of the nutrients its body needed to the underground trunk. This creature full of divine power and divine radiance stared at the little girl in front of it. Its staple food was still the flesh and blood of various living creatures. Soren slashed out 3 times in a row. Are you summoning me? However, the effect was not very high. You look like a little girl who hasn't grown up. The part of the rip flower that was directly above its body had a very strong defensive ability. Are you sure you want to make a deal with me? When he slashed it, it was like slashing a dragon creature in front of him. It did not cause much damage. He immediately guessed what spell Vivian had just cast. Was attacked. Limited although wish. The rip flower had level no 7 eyes or facial features. The djinn in front of him looked a bit like the monster in Aladdin's magic lamp. Then the huge bud suddenly opened its upper body was still in human form, and its skin was pale blue. Unfortunately, he was already prepared. Its pupils seemed to flash with lightning from time to time. Instead, he took the opportunity to slash at the bottom summoned by wish was at the level of a god. Was not cut off the strength level of the one in front of him couldn't be judged. Soren took the opportunity to slash several times in a row, level, and only then did he break the feeding organ special rules. They followed the constraints of contracts and laws. There seemed to be a strange trade with spellcasters when necessary. And then he saw this was a djinn above the demigod level. Then the ground under Soren's feet, not the main body of the djinn. Only some very special transactions could make the main body of the djinn appear. But the was even possible to summon the oldest began to wither rapidly after being disconnected, as if it suddenly lost the wind elemental plane once. Then the other part below seemed to have drilled deeper into the vanguards. Soren stabbed the ground with his sword and then said to the djinn in front of her with a serious face, "Let's go back first." Yen Soren frowned as if he was thinking about something. He looked at his data prompt and did not receive any slaughter EXP. It seemed that the rip flower was not dead yet. After he stepped back for a while, he said in a low voice, "As soon as the little girl spoke, not to come here first." Soren was instantly dumbfounded because she was speaking the demonic language. There may be something terrible. Never felt so deeply that learning a foreign language was so important, especially when it came to the demonic language, which was widely used in many plants. The most important part of a plant was definitely was a neutral creature. Many old trees elemental planes were basically not involved in the battle, but if there was a problem with their roots, they would unless there was any idiot who was ready to unify the universe and transform the entire multidimensional plane. Whether it was man-eating flowers, the 4 elemental planes would basically not stand up and do anything. Their core weakness was the djinn could also trade with the things on the surface of the ground. As long as it was any spellcaster who used the wishing spell, they could trade for them to grow back. When a plant mutated to this extent, It was almost the same as an animal.
demonic language,
although
that
they did
Soren
not
could
have as much
understand
intelligence as animals. They still relied on their instincts to do things. This area should be one of the places left behind by the disaster, but he did not know what was inside. With Soren's current strength, it was not a big problem for him to deal with these things. This was going to kill him. But this place was too strange, wanted to interrupt, and he did not dare to take the risk to communicate in the common language. It was better to leave this place for later, as he had a lot of things to do. These Jinn were actually not easy to talk to. Just as Soren was about to seal off this place, the Jinn temporarily prevent others from approaching Vivian. Adele Isabella took out a roll of parchment out of thin air, she raised her finger and pointed and began to write quickly. Your Excellency, the contract scroll. There seems to be something there. Down and handed the contract scroll in its hand to the little Vivian. Then the little girl looked at it carefully for a while, then pointed out one of the points and argued paying attention to the strange trees nearby. It was obvious that the difference in strength between the two sides was huge. However, in the face of the little girl's impolite tone of argument, it seemed that the Jinn was not angry buried under the ground. Their contract was full of all kinds of traps. He could only make a gesture to the red-haired female pirate behind him. And then the two of them used their weapons to dig out the grayish-black stone at the same time. Amazement and said seriously, "Very good." Soren's face showed according to the contract, I will take a part of your divine power black stone and then give you some other abilities because of the long-term weathering and the passage of time. If there is no problem, no longer looked like it used to. Vivian was very fast. But he could vaguely tell that it was part of a building pen and signed it, and it should have existed for a long time. A satisfied smile. Obsidian was a very strong and durable ore, and pointed at Vivian, and it had been weathered for at least thousands of years. Emerged and took a very rare little girl's divine power. It could be used in many places. Then it stretched out its finger and pointed at Vivian on a large scale, and a divine light appeared in its eyes. In Soren's memory, there were only two places where it could be used. Soren couldn't help but golem puppet. Then he felt was the Magus Tower. He didn't see the golems or the adepts tower with his soul. This area was definitely the territory of a powerful adept a long time ago. He could determine Vivian's position and how far away she was from him. Obsidian fragments as long as he concentrated, it was highly likely that there was something related to the adept's direction. It was like a very strong telepathy. Thinking of this, Soren's breathing quickened. Even if it was a broken Magus tower that had been around for thousands of years, under the dim light of the night, it was still very tempting to him. Soren's figure even if all the functions inside were destroyed, tropical many of the things stored inside still had astonishing value. He was not unfamiliar with such a terrain. This place might be an ancient the outer islands to complete a legendary level mission. There might be information spells from the Arcane Empire that had survived. This group of guys had a very powerful tracking ability. They could try and take a look through footprints. Soren, who was planning to leave, decided to go in and explore. Even Soren had improved a lot of tracking skills. He told the red-haired female pirate behind him, "Pay attention to the surroundings. Lightly on a big tree, let's try not to disturb these plants." And then slowly landed on the ground. They looked like there were many messy footprints in front of him. At this time, the sky was a little dark. Although a lot of them were covered by weeds, Soren looked up at the traces left by high-speed movements were still very obvious beside him. Soren raised his hand and went around traces of something being dragged away. There were many strange trees and flowers like the traces left by heels. They looked very large. He found a little dark red forest, but there was not much blood. Occasionally they would touch some leaves and the battle was over soon. A little. Soren could already imagine the situation at that time. These strange plants seemed to only attack creatures when they were attacked or needed to eat. Before they could react, this was very similar to how beasts would not be aggressive when they were escaped. The vision in front gradually widened. Looks like they're all a large lavender flower. Soren's eyes showed a trace of coldness, murmuring, and his face showed a cruel expression. It just looks a bit like said, "Kill these scouts." He looked back at the red-haired female pirate of the indigenous tribes. "Be careful. Jungle fighting was different from flat ground fighting. This place did not look like it grew naturally. Encounter and ambush fighting. It looked like it was even a grade 4 profession could die in the hands of a low-grade profession that was proficient in tracking and hiding. There were strange too many environments for ambush. They seemed to be many natural traps that could be used, but most of them did not germinate because the ground could not support 5 levels higher than them here. Some of the flower seeds had been damaged and disappeared, but there were still some that hiding traps. It was just that he did not know what they were used for. Hidden weapons, etc. Soren felt that these plants were dangerous. This time they might not be so lucky because rogues were also experts in this field, so he did not dare to disturb them. Soren moved quickly along the traces. Many of the plants here seemed to be alive. His tracking ability was not very good, strange flowers, but it was not enough to lose the traces left today. Buildings appeared in front of them. Rangers could even track the traces left a few days ago, and there were all kinds of strange plants what kind of enemy left them. Even with Soren's experience, had always he could not tell what importance to tracking skills. He could not even find an entrance to the building in front of him. He could be sure that the indigenous situation from the outside to the tribe, because they could not know the number of Soren's men if they were not close to the camp, or even help you to open up a tunnel to explore. After crossing a stream, ancient Soren's figure gradually underground ruins did not even leave you an entrance. He heard a little movement. What should I do then? Was a scream. Dig. It seemed that the pirate scouts sent out during the day were not all killed by them. High-level adventurers, and 1 or 2 survivors were brought back by them. Many sunken cities in the desert would collapse, and a trace of killing intent appeared in Soren's eyes. Many years ago, many people dug all the way to find treasure in shadows. When Soren saw the surface of the ruins that did not even leave a hole for him, There were
He
many
knew that
places
today's
in the outer
exploration would
islands
have
that
to
looked
stop
like the
here.
Irish coastline.
This building had
The
completely
landscape
sunk
structure
into the
here was
ground,
completely
and it
different
might even
from
be
the
filled
southern
with
continental
seawater.
shelf.
Anyway, many
What Soren
things could
saw
happen.
in front of him was
There
a
was no way
natural
to go in
cave.
now.
It seemed
Soren
that the
had to
enemy
open
was
up a
quite
tunnel
familiar
here,
with the
then
nearby
arrange for
terrain.
people to dig,
No one had
and
come to
finally
this
find
cave
a
for a
tunnel
long
that could
time.
be entered together.
It was a little dark
He observed
inside,
for a
and
while.
the cave was not very
He
deep.
was ready to memorize
Soren
the
heard a
surrounding
slight scream
environment
again
and some
and saw a
landmarks,
faint fire in
but
the
at this
cave.
time,
The
it seemed that
red-haired
there was a
female
corner in the
pirate
cave.
suddenly said,
He did not
"Your
recklessly
Excellency."
sneak in.
Look at the
Soren
corner of the
reached
wall
out
and
and
touched
seemed
the
to be
ground,
something wrong.
carefully observing the
Her
surroundings.
detection ability seemed to
His
be
dark
very
vision
strong.
allowed him to see as
Soren
clearly
looked
at
at the
night as during
red-haired
the
female
day.
pirate with
Soon
some
he
surprise,
found a rather clever
and then
alarm
moved
trap.
towards the wall.
The indigenous
He did
people
not
were
know if
very
this
cunning,
woman's intuition
and their
was
living
high or her
environment was
basic
also
skills
very
were
harsh.
strong,
But
for
her
someone who
detection
could
ability
easily
seemed
kill
to be
the
a little
pirate
stronger
scout
than
sent by
his.
Soren,
In
it
front
was
of Soren was
impossible
a
for
plant
them to
that
looked
looked
a
a
bit
bit like a
at
lantern
night.
plant.
Soren's
He did
trap
not dare
skills
to
were
get
not
too
enough,
close, so he went
he
around
glanced
to the
at it
back
and felt
then
that he
saw a
might not be
strange
able to
gray crack.
successfully remove
A
the trap
spatial
without
crack.
making a sound. Soren's
Even if he
expression
was
was
lucky
lucky
enough
enough
to
to remove it,
and
he
he
murmured,
would take too long.
"The shadow plane."
Soren reached out
The
and
building
grabbed
here
the
is
edge of the
connected
cave.
to the shadow
Then
plane.
he climbed into
It
the
seemed to
cave
be a
along the
permanently
corner as if he was
solidified
hanging in the
dimensional
air.
rift.
He
Did
was
the
just
owner
one
of
or
this
2
place in the
centimeters
past
away
open
from
up
the
a
alarm
fixed
trap.
portal?
The people
The shadow
inside the
plane.
trap would be
The
immediately
non-material
alerted.
plane that Soren
The
was most
scream
familiar
continued.
with.
He
There
just
were broken
glanced at the
stones in the
spatial
cave,
crack
so
in front of
Soren
him,
had to be
and he
careful.
roughly guessed
He
its
heard the
function and
common
reason.
language and the
He
indigenous
was sure that he
language,
was more than
but he could not
90%
hear what
correct.
was being said clearly
This was not
because the
arrogance
screams were
but
interrupted.
confidence.
The
He
enemy
had
seemed to
traveled
be
to the shadow
interrogating
plane
him.
too many times,
Soren did not
and he
dare
even
to be
lived in the
careless.
shadow plane for
His
a period
figure
of time.
slowly approached
Let's
in the
go.
dark.
As he
Soren
turned
looked
up
up
at
at
the
the
sky
sky
and
and
the
said
situation
slowly,
in front of
"We'll
him
come
appeared
back
in front
later."
of his eyes.
It's too dangerous
He saw
to go
5
in rashly
indigenous
now.
people with oil
The
paint on
shadow
their
plane
bodies.
was not to be
The
trifled
skin of
with,
these indigenous
because
people
although
was
the
darker,
shadow
but it
plane
was
was
not like
connected
the
to the
black
material
race.
plane,
Instead,
the
it
environment
was
of
like
the
the
two
two
was
was
not
not
the
the
black
same,
race and the
and there
Native
may be
Americans.
some ancient and
The bone
dangerous
structure
creatures.
of these guys was
Moving
thicker,
in the shadow plane,
obviously
you may
thicker than the
encounter
bone
monsters
frame
with
of
a
the
challenge
challenge
rating
rating
of
of grade
They
3
were
or above at
interrogating
any
a pirate
time,
scout,
and the ratio
The
of
pirate who was being
quasi-legendary creatures to
interrogated was
legendary
badly
monsters was
mutilated.
quite large.
His appearance
much
could not
larger
be
than in the
distinguished at
material
all.
plane. His
And there
breathing
were
was
shadow
also very
dragons
weak.
in many places.
It seemed that he would
The
not
two of
last
them
long.
carefully retreated.
There was an indigenous
At this
person
time,
who looked
the camp
different
was
next to
almost
him.
completed.
It was obvious
Although
that
it
he
was
did
still
not
very
have oil
simple
paint
after
on his
all,
body.
it had only
A
been a
cold
day,
light
so
appeared
Soren
in
did not
Soren's
ask for
eyes,
anything.
because he
Today's
recognized that
discovery
this
in the
indigenous
strange
person
jungle
was one of
the
the
focus
slaves
of
who
Soren's
escaped from him.
consideration.
Because he
The
knew the
slaves
common
were driven
language, he
together
was
by the
helping to
pirates,
translate the
and after working
interrogation
for
and
half a
telling them
day,
the
they
information
also
in the
received
indigenous
some food
language.
at this moment.
Although it was very
1,
rough
2,
and poor
3, 4,
quality,
5.
at least it could fill
Soren's
their stomachs.
eyes were full of killing
Soren was
intent.
not a stingy person.
He quietly
If the
approached the
slaves
enemy
were
who
not
had been
fed,
asking
they would not have
questions
the
and looked
strength
like
to
the
work.
leader of the
It
indigenous
was a very
people.
simple principle.
Backstab.
The night
Shadow
passed quickly.
strike.
When
An
Soren
icy
woke
cold
up and
light
was about to
suddenly
think
appeared.
about how to explore
Soren's
the strange
figure
place,
emerged from
the
the
half-elf
shadows.
first mate
The
walked in
legendary
quickly and
curved
said,
sword
"Your
icing death
Excellency,
drew a cold light
last
and
night
instantly
3
pierced the heart
slaves
of the
secretly
indigenous
escaped.
leader.
The tip of the sword
Soren's
penetrated from
face
the back to
instantly
the turned
turned
pale. The other party's
half-elf
expression
first
was
mate
full
noticed
of
his
shock.
expression and quickly
Before he
said,
could change,
"But two
he
of them
died
were
under
caught by
Soren's
us as soon
hands.
as they ran out.
A row of
The
data
other one
quickly
escaped
appeared.
into the jungle.
Shadow strike
I have
successful.
already sent people to
Shadow
catch him.
strike launched. All of them were
Backstab
natives.
launched.
Your
Successfully
Excellency,
launched
I suggest
backstab
that these
causing
natives be handcuffed to
116
work.
plus 10,
They are much
piercing
more
damage to the
disobedient than other
target.
slaves. Piercing the
Soren's
target's face
heart
was very gloomy.
triggered the test
After
of death.
hearing the half-elf first
Target's
mate's
test of
words,
death
he
failed.
gently shook his head and then
Target
said with
dead.
a cold expression,
Extracting the
"No
target's
need.
soul energy.
Pass down my order
Received
to prepare 2 crosses
slaughter
and nail the
EXP.
2 runaway slaves
As the
on
slaughter
them.
EXP
The crosses
data
will be
emerged.
erected at the
Soren
place where the
immediately
slaves are
guessed the
working.
approximate strength
The
of the
half-elf
opponent
first
in
mate
his
heard
mind.
this and showed a
It should
cruel
be an
smile.
enemy above profession
He
level
immediately
15,
nodded and said,
a leader in
"Okay."
the indigenous tribe.
Your Excellency. The enemy seemed to have
I
more
will
than
100 HP, but because his heart was pierced, piracy was not a benevolent profession. Therefore, he could not survive for a period of time like some of the enemies that Soren had encountered in the past. Sword form. Chapter 250. Spinning strike. A faint light after appeared on the enemy's leader with a sneak attack. On the left side of the Soren did not retreat. Nearly 300 on the contrary, he rushed up together, directly, trembling. Another in front of them was a group of pirates out of fierce faces. He spun it in a circle not far away. The other two enemies in front of him, pirates caught off guard. One this was the most common reaction under one hand and the other carrying them in one hand. Many people were caught off guard. Behind them, their ability to dodge and parry was greatly reduced. They each held a wooden stake. It was the best time to test one's ability in front of the group of slaves. One of the indigenous people almost subconsciously dodged sideways. The half-elf first-mate's face was not very good, but the other indigenous person was just ready to show off in front of Soren. He was directly hit in the chest by Soren, that a slave would run away the next day. His lung was cut open. This was tantamount to a slap in the face. The former was an indigenous person telling Soren that he was incompetent, while the latter obviously did not have any impression of the slaves who ran away. Once he even wanted to skin them situation, he would inevitably be slowed by the slaves in front of him coldly. In the face of Soren, who suddenly appeared and killed their leader, the indigenous people reacted quickly. They began to fight back quickly. However, instead of pulling out a weapon, they quickly took out a blow dart, and then two burly pirates came over with two indigenous slaves who were obviously steel needles. Then a one-eyed man with a missing left eye stood up with a grin. It should have. He held a hammer and nail in his hand. The blow dart because of the manufacturing process, the nail in this era was not the kind strong and familiar with, had no effect but the kind of conical nail that was as thick as a finger. The blow dart fell to the ground. The one-eyed man winked at the person next to him, slashed at the seriously injured enemy, and then someone forcibly separated the two slaves and fixed their limbs on the rough cross. A row of data quickly appeared. Shadow Strike activated. The two Aborigines seemed to know their fate. Plus 10. They couldn't help but tremble. Damage to the target. One of them seemed to be able to speak a little bit of the common damage to the target. He kept crying and begged. Dead. The slaves below didn't dare to look at him. But no matter how he begged, it was useless. The one-eyed man raised the hammer with a grin, and then pointed the nail at his palm. As the icing death with a bang, right hand, the nail that was as thick as a finger went through the palm of the indigenous slave, and then it hit the wooden stake behind him. Soren, who had an incomparably shrill dual sounded, could almost achieve the effect of left and right. A stream of blood flowed out of the palm that was nailed in both hands and then dripped along the finger to the ground. When he killed the indigenous slaves who were executed, his left hand almost immediately turned around, and the voice in their mouth had changed a little from the side. They were still begging, expressing their regret and his arm with his right hand. But in the end, there was no mercy for them. With a splash of blood, 3 fingers were cut off, and then nailed their other palm on the wooden swords turned into cold lights. But this was just the beginning. He turned around to cut off half of the hand. Used a total of 9 nails. At the same time, a distorted shadow appeared, then the elbow, then the foot, and then 2 heads fell to the ground. As for the last nail, Shadow Strike. This was used only at the end of the punishment. Sword form, beheading. When the victim was about to bleed out, he did not hesitate at all. The executioner would shadow and very long and narrow the enemy and drive it into the enemy's head. Under normal circumstances, a headless body fell to the ground. Was not used because it was covered in blood, with the nature and there was only one enemy left in front of him. Many places believed that if the nail was pierced into the forehead, the victim's soul would be nailed to the cross, and there was a chance that this person would become a terrifying, vengeful facing the last enemy. After all, Soren still didn't hesitate at all. Creatures. His two professionals didn't dare to say that shrouded the enemy's vital points. After all, he didn't need to travel the enemy spiritual world and he didn't need to torture anything. Soren watched the whole process of the execution. Since Soren had already planned to explore the enemy's details, otherwise there was no need to torture him more and more unmanageable in the future. More importantly, he was a person who respected the rules, and he didn't have a sense of historical mission to remove the slavery system. Soren stabbed into the technological level of his previous life. The slavery system was only removed a long time later, and the finally cut off economy at that time was completely mastering by slave labor. Beheading. In his previous life, had become more and more fond of the slavery system was delayed as long as the enemy's head was cut off, which showed how amazing the remaining power of the system was. But if the other parts of the body were cut off, they could still hold on for a while. Although it might not be a good thing, this may also be related to the hidden couldn't be shaken because many gods and churches supported the slavery system. Blood of a berserker deep in his heart. A row of indigenous slaves who were nailed to the wooden stake found that the enemy gave a lot of slaughter. Their initial shrill screams had changed, and now they were almost similar to ordinary people. But the whole process wasn't over yet. Class of the indigenous people was gradually coagulate because it wasn't a fatal wound, which was basically a way to gain exposed to the sun for a while before they died. The ordinary work was basically all on the bottom level of the indigenous people. After they died, the 5 enemies would all be nailed to the wooden frame. And then because there were no spellcasters among scavengers, the slaughter EXP they gave was similar to wilderness monsters of the same bodies until only the bones were left. This punishment process may last was given to Soren. It mainly depended on how many crows were attracted. After killing 20 or so of these enemies, this punishment Soren could easily level up his profession. Some of the slaves below were scared. Sure enough, sneak attacks or Aborigines were nailed to the cross. There were 2 keys to Soren's and then erected in front of them. One was that the sneak attack of the backstab began the enemy off them to work. In this situation, it was easy to expand the victory in an instant. Worked very hard. The other was that only when they stopped occasionally and saw the two of their kind nailed to the enemy's blow dart would their eyes reveal a trace of sadness. Had more than 20 points of constitution, there were also some who rejoiced in other people's misfortune. The poison on the blow dart. Half of the slaves were indigenous people, and the other half were mainland people had good skills in toxicology. The indigenous people would even better than the alchemists on the outer islands where there were very few spellcasters among the Aborigines. Would never want to escape because they couldn't survive if they escaped. The existence of special beings with psionic powers. If it wasn't for the scarcity of slaves on the mainland, there were basically no wizards here, only sorcerers and shamans. Soren really intended to buy more. Kind of priest, and their spells were quite different. Vivian's figure appeared not far away. Since there were no real gods in the outer islands, the little girl was wearing a black princess dress. Priests were more inclined. She raised her small hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes, which were similar to evocation magic attacks. What happened just now? I seem to hear someone screaming. The little girl slept areas for a long time beliefs were distributed. Recently, this kind of shaman priest was more common, but she didn't know the reason. There were also ancient shaman doctrines that simply worshipped the souls of their ancestors. Was normal. and her
Surveys
physical
had
condition
shown that the
seemed to
more
be very
civilized
good.
a place was,
One
and the
more
more
obvious thing
widespread
was
the
that her
written
strength was
education,
much greater
the
than
higher
before.
the possibility of
At present,
spellcasters
she had the
appearing
strength
there.
of a 12 or
Soren started to
13-year-old
collect the
child.
loot.
Maybe
The
the little
Aborigines
girl was
didn't have
developing.
anything valuable
Soren
on them,
felt that she
and
was
Soren
about
wasn't
1 or 2
looking for
centimeters
gold,
taller
silver,
than before.
or jewelry.
Now she was
He
probably a
rummaged
little
through the
taller
bodies
than
of the
Aladdin.
Aborigines and
But
soon
speaking
found
of
6
which,
blowers
Aladdin
and
was
a
really
small
short.
bottle of unknown
Vivian
potion.
seemed to have just
There were
woken
steel
up.
needles soaked
She
in
rubbed
it.
the corner of her
Soren
eyes
tried
in a
to
daze,
identify the
then
item,
blinked
and
her
when he
big
saw
eyes
the
and looked
attributes,
around.
he was so shocked
When she
that
heard
he
the
broke out in
subordinate
cold
beside her
sweat.
explain what just
Item
happened,
type.
she
Low
couldn't
dart,
help but
plus
pout and
3,
nodded
item
seriously.
grade. It should be
Rare,
like this.
grade 3,
This group of
item
lowly
description.
slaves. This is
As
a
the
very
private
special
property
blow
of my
dart
brother,
that originated
they
from
actually
the
dared to
Aborigine
escape.
scouts in the outer
They should be
islands.
nailed to death.
In the thousands of years
Let's
of
see if they
history
dare
of the
to escape in the
Aborigines,
future.
although it didn't
At
bring them
first,
civilization
Soren
and
was
wisdom,
a little worried that
it
the
allowed them to
kind-hearted
develop
girl
some
would
other
reject this
special
kind of
skills.
punishment.
This
But
blow
hearing
dart
the
is
words
smeared
from the
with a
little girl's
refined and
mouth,
purified
Soren couldn't
neurotoxin.
help but smile.
It will start to take
This was
effect
his
in the
Vivian,
blink of an eye
the
after
little
hitting
girl
the
who
enemy.
said,
If
"The
you kill
dosage of a
someone,
blow
I'll help
dart
you
can anesthetize
an
elephant for a
Kindness
short
couldn't solve
time."
the problem.
There are very
At
few
least
humans
most
who
of the
can
time,
successfully
kindness
resist it.
couldn't solve the problem.
Requirements,
It would only
none.
make the problem
Effect,
worse.
causes
It wasn't
5
time
to
for
10
Soren to
poison
show his
damage to the
kindness.
target,
And
now
then
the
after
outer
hitting the
islands could
target,
be said to
a
be in
test of
danger at every
anesthetizing
step.
toxin with
There
a
were all
difficulty
kinds
of
of
20
dangerous
points will
things
be
and all
initiated.
kinds of hidden troubles.
Any target that
He would
can't
never
pass
allow
the
his
test will
slaves
faint
to
in
make
his
trouble
trouble
for
for
him.
Damn.
Today,
It's
Vivian
actually
seemed
a
to be
grade 3 rare
particularly
item.
bold.
Soren
She raised her
immediately
hand
broke
and
out in
straightened her
cold sweat
beautiful
when he
black
saw the
princess
item's
dress.
data because he
Then
found
tied
that
her
the
hair into a
probability of
double
him passing
ponytail
the
with a
test was
hairband.
less than 50%.
The little girl had a single
Fortunately,
ponytail
he
and a
activated
double
the
ponytail
stone skin
every
spell
day.
in advance,
She seemed to be
or else
having
he
a
might
lot
have
of fun.
failed miserably.
She tilted her
Soren
head
took
and
a
looked
quick
at the
look
2
and put away
bloody
the blow
indigenous
darts,
slaves
needles,
nailed to the
and
wooden
potions.
stake.
Then
He
he
leaned
leaned
over
over
and
and
looked
looked
at the
captured
other
pirate
busy
scout.
slaves.
The
Two
pirate
of the
was already
slaves
breathing out
immediately
more
knelt
than he
down
was
when they
breathing
saw
in.
her and
The
kowtowed with
tendons
an
in his
excited
hands and feet
expression.
were all cut off.
It seemed that she had
It was
used
basically
magic to save the
impossible
2
to save
guys.
him. The
Unless
little
there was
girl
a
nodded
high-grade priest
reservedly.
to cast a
She looked
restoration
down at
spell
them
on
like a
him,
noble
he would be
princess and said,
paralyzed even if he
"Work
was barely
hard."
saved.
The key was that there were no
I
priests
remember
in the
my
camp.
brother said that as long
I've
as you
avenged
work hard, some of you
Soren
will be
walked
granted
over
freedom.
with a blank
My
expression,
brother
held
always
his
keeps
hand
his
and
words.
said in a deep
I
voice,
believe you will soon
"Let me
be free."
relieve your pain." A cold light appeared. After relieving the pain of the dying pirate,
Chapter
he slowly
251.
closed his eyes.
The others obviously
there was no
didn't
other
believe
way
the
in this
little girl's
situation.
words.
Many
He had
times
never
after
heard
a
of a
battle,
slave owner
there
who
were
would
wounded
generously
people who
grant
needed
freedom
others
to the
to
slaves
relieve
in
their
front
pain.
of him,
After
let alone
all,
give
the number
freedom
of
to a
priests was
portion of
only
them.
a small number,
Most of the
and it was
slaves
difficult
showed a
to
trace of doubt
popularize
on their
expensive
faces.
divine spells.
Some of them even had
Otherwise,
a mocking
the
expression,
disputes in various
thinking that
places
this
would
was
not
not
be
be
at
to
this
fool them
level.
into working hard.
However, the 2 northern slaves who were
Soren
saved by
slowly
Vivian
stood
were
up and
pleasantly
glanced
surprised.
coldly at the indigenous
They
slave
seemed to
who was
believe the
killed by
words
him.
of the little
If this guy
angel-like
didn't
girl in
escape,
front of them.
the indigenous
It
people
didn't matter
probably
whether the
wouldn't have
slaves
found him
believed
so
it or
quickly.
not,
Back.
because the
Soren
supervisors
stepped
were the
on the
fierce and
indigenous
cruel
slave's
pirates,
head
and then walked
If
out
the
of the
slaves
cave.
didn't work hard,
Killing these
they
scouts
believed
was
that
only
the
the
pirates
first
who
step.
were used to seeing
Since
blood
Soren
and
had
cruel
the
means had
intention to
ways
kill
to make
the
them
indigenous
obedient.
people,
This
he
was the
naturally had
advantage
no
of being
mercy
a
in his
pirate.
heart. With
Under
such
the
a group
pitch
of
black night
subordinates, they
sky,
could do things without
Soren's
rules.
figure moved
Their
forward at
cruelty
high
and
speed in the jungle.
bloodthirstiness could help
The
Soren
night
solve
was
a
his
lot of
best
problems.
disguise.
Some
At
of the
the same
things that
time,
couldn't
with
be
the
seen
blessing
in the
of
light of
dark
day
vision,
didn't even need to be
Soren
done by
was
him.
even more
The
drowsed than
pirate leader
drowsed.
below had already
Some night
helped him
hunting
solve
beasts
it.
began to appear,
Anyway,
and
Soren
Soren
wasn't a
carefully
kind and
avoided
noble
them.
person.
There were some
So what if
strange
the
fluorescent
means were
plants
cruel?
around.
Now, only
If a
cruel
flying
means
insect
could make them
approached,
obedient.
it would be
The
swallowed
punishment
immediately.
over there was still
There were many
continuing.
types of
The
carnivorous
2
plants
natives
in
who
the outer
escaped were
islands,
almost
so
dead
even
after
animals
being
would not
exposed
easily
to the
get
sun
close
for a
to
whole
some
morning.
places.
The
Soren
sound
thought
of a
about
river
it
came
and
from
didn't
the
let his
front.
subordinates hammer
Soren
the
moved
nails into
forward
their
quickly.
foreheads.
This island was
Instead,
not
he
very
let them
big,
die
about
on the
50
wooden
kilometers
stakes
in
and then
length.
handed them to
It
the
was
was narrow at both ends and wide in the middle. Nailing the nails into the primitive jungle really give birth to the undead. And then there was a river flowing from another island. Wasn't afraid at all. The width of the river was about 50 meters. The two natives didn't last long. There was nothing strange on the surface. Their vitality was different after people went down. They died on the first day, was not but their bodies were still standing in the place where the slaves even if they could provide about at 2 slaughter EXP. Crows, vultures, the signs of human activity in front began to become obvious. The half-elf first mate's face didn't look very good. Broken fishing nets. He came over and whispered, "The indigenous people's source of food was one of the slaves who escaped is missing. They also knew how to farm. We couldn't track him down. The area of land that could be farmed was not much. Useless." Soren's figure gradually merged into the darkness. After Soren heard the other party's words, he frowned slightly, then waved his hand and said, "Soon he saw the cultivated land. There was no need to care about him anymore. There were no crops in the land now." But he ordered the others to prepare to lay the foundation to the field. Then you take some people to the torches in the distance. I need some dwarven crowd of people. It's best if they know how to make sure that there were no hidden sentries nearby. Find a way to poach other people with construction skills. He was not sure if the indigenous people here had any special means, so he did not get a sum of money. You can take it out and use it at any time. Looking at the number of houses, the population was about 1,500 people. This kind of construction craftsman's population was more densely distributed because they could not survive in the outer islands with a small number of individuals. I will definitely find a way to bring them over. The indigenous people. Speaking of this, A
They
cold
all
light
lived in
flashed
low
in his
shacks,
eyes,
and the surroundings
he had
were very
already
messy.
messed up once, so
In
he
the
couldn't
center
mess
there
it
was
up
a tall
again.
building, and
This
in the
time,
distance
even
there
if
were
he had to
torches and
kidnap them,
guards.
he had to
The
kidnap them.
indigenous people had
In
a
any
tribal
case, they were
system,
pirates.
similar to the
Pirates
tribal
did not
system
need
in
to reason
Africa,
with
where
people.
one could marry more
If they
than 100
recruited
wives
people
to
through
work.
normal means,
The
there
internal
might be all
hierarchy
kinds
was
of messy
strict,
requests
and the gap was
matters.
quite large. He just brought people with him and went over with knives. He wanted to
Sauron
see who
glanced
would
at
dare
it for
not
a
come.
moment, and then
Now,
quietly
anyone with a
sneaked in.
discerning eye could see that His Excellency Throat Cutter was preparing to establish a foundation here. Whether or not he could perform well would determine his
Chapter
future status.
259.
As soon as he entered the tribe,
Soren nodded gently
Soren
and said,
immediately smelled
"You go
the
and
strange
call
smell.
Adele in, and then
He
call
couldn't tell
One-Eyed
what the
Dragon."
smell was, but it was
The
indeed
half-elf
a little
first
stinky.
responded and
the
retreated.
environment of the entire
After a
tribe
while,
was very
the
dirty
figure
and
of the
messy.
red-haired
There were
female
feces
pirate
left by
appeared
children
outside the
everywhere
tent.
on the ground.
She came in and
Even the
bowed
road was
slightly,
not
then said,
deliberately
"What are your
smooth,
orders?"
and there was black mud
Soren
when he
looked up
stepped
at
on
her,
it. Then handed
The
over a
tribe
white
was
stone
surrounded
and
by
directly
low huts.
ordered,
This
the
is
simple
iguana
fences
stone.
were useless to
It's
Soren.
a very valuable
He could see the
fertilizer.
lower
It
aborigines
can be
gathered
used on
in a
crops
mass.
after a little
There were more than
refining.
5 or 6
It can
members
greatly
in a
increase
family.
the yield of
It
crops.
gave him a feeling of
You
an
take
African
people to
tribe.
send this stone
Even
to
if
the
it had a
alchemy guild
history
of
of
the
thousands
Wizard
of
Alliance.
years, there was
I
no
believe they will be
civilization
interested
in this stone. War, chaos, and killing.
Just send it over.
The environment
If they are
destroys
interested,
the hope
let
of
them send
civilization.
someone to talk to me.
Only the oldest
Guano
traditions
stone,
and order were
the
still
red-haired
maintained,
female
and the
pirate's
numb rulers
expression was a
ruled
little
these lower
puzzled.
aborigines.
Although she had
The
mastered
low
a lot
huts
of
formed a
knowledge,
circle,
she didn't know much
and only
about
the
farming.
center of the tribe could
However,
be lit
this
with
didn't affect
relatively
her
rare
understanding
resin
of the
torches.
meaning of fertilizer.
Everything here was so primitive
she
and
immediately
barren.
nodded and said,
Soren could even
"I'll
see
go
simple
now.
stone tools.
I promise to send it
Steel was
over."
also a very rare
Very
resource
good.
here, and it was
Soren
mainly
nodded
used for
slightly
weapons
and
and
said in a
knives.
deep voice,
However, he
"I've
could see
asked
some
people to
bronze
prepare
tools.
3 boxes
The
of
small
samples.
indigenous tribes
You
were
can send
basically
them
quite
directly by a
primitive.
fast ship,
Only the
and then
tribes
help
that
me
had
purchase the
established
things on
towns
the
had
order.
many skills. Speaking
In
of
fact,
this, life was
Soren
far
took
from
out a
as
list
easy
and
as you
said,
think.
"There is
The
still
most
some of
basic
money
things
in
were
Port
clothing,
Tylon.
food,
You can
shelter,
go and get
and
it.
transportation.
The things I need
Clothes
must be
were ranked
delivered
before
and the
food.
things I need must be
Perhaps
brought
in the
back
more
next month."
civilized mainland areas,
Adele Isabella
clothes were
nodded
something
with a
that could be
serious
bought with
expression
money,
and said,
but there were
"Yes,
not many
sir.
transactions
I
here.
promise to complete
Soren
the
saw
task."
a lot of lower
Soren
aborigines
waved
who
his
were
hand
not fully
gently.
clothed. The red-haired
Many of the
female
aborigines
pirate
couldn't
children
help
were
but look
basically
back at
sleeping
him
with their
before
buttocks
going out.
naked. Then
The
she went
clothes
out
in
and
the
met
outer
her
islands
ferocious
were mainly
looking
animal
animal
skins
skins
and a
linen
bald
and other
hook-nosed
plant
pirate.
fibers. The
Animal
animal
skins
skins
that
that
the
the
red-haired
red-haired
female
female
pirate
and linen also
slightly.
needed to be
Their
planted and
expressions didn't
exchanged.
seem to be too
If the
respectful.
location of the tribe
However,
was far
after
away from
walking
the
into the
indigenous
tent,
town,
they were a lot more
many
honest.
of the most basic
They
needs
quickly
of life
bowed
could
their
not
heads
be met.
respectfully and
Here,
said,
the finished
"Your
cloth was
Excellency."
something that could be
The
used as
hook-nosed
money for
pirate was the
transactions
first
and
to speak.
consumption. He
Note,
bowed slightly
it was
and
similar
said,
to the cloth
3 of
used
us were
as a
bitten
substitute
today.
currency in
There are too
ancient
many
China.
poisonous insects
Soren
and
soon
snakes
saw
here.
their food.
The brothers
Basically,
below are
as
a little
expected,
frightened.
it was a kind of
Your
black
Excellency,
porridge mixed with vegetables, leaves, and all
are we
kinds
going
of
to
other
scatter
things.
the powder we
There was
brought
also
over?
a kind of ugly
Soren
black
stood
bread
up
on the
when he
side,
heard the
which was
words.
similar to a hard
He went
wooden
outside
stick.
the tent and looked
Soren
up at the
could
sky.
tell that they had plenty
The sun
of
was
food,
better
but
today.
there wasn't much oil
He
or
thought
water.
for a moment and
Their
said,
food was
"Wait
messy as
until
well
noon
because
because
Soren
Soren
saw a palm-sized
scattered
spider
around the camp. Most of the
First,
huts were like
let
this.
people pay attention
the
to
inferior
cleaning up the
aborigines
surroundings.
lived in groups. The environment
Even
here
if
was
they were
very
mating,
bad.
they did not
There were
avoid
many
children.
poisonous
The
insects
children
and
here
snakes
were
overseas.
considered adults when
If
they
you
were
were
about 13
accidentally
years
bitten,
old.
it would be troublesome.
Soren didn't stay for
If you
too
were
long.
lightly bitten,
He
you would
walked
bleed
along
and
the muddy
bleed.
road towards
If
the
you were
center of the
seriously
tribe.
poisoned, you would die. Even the mosquitoes here could cause wound
To be
infection
honest,
and worsen.
Soren couldn't
When
understand
Soren
the
came,
thinking
he
of the
considered all
Aborigines.
aspects. They had
He was
so
a
much
person who
manpower,
planned
so
and
why
acted.
didn't they just clean
He
up the
did bring
road?
a lot of insect
Maybe they were
repellent
used
powder,
to this
but
kind
it
of
was not
living
to deal with
environment.
these poisonous
Patrolling
insects,
guards
but to
appeared
deal
in
with
front
more
of them.
troublesome things.
The ground near the
But
center
now
was
that there were
actually
almost a
paved with
dozen
broken
non-combat
stones.
casualties,
Soren had
it was
just
better
better
to
nearby
scatter the
when he
powder
heard a
quickly.
series of rapid breathing, crashing
Suddenly, a
sounds,
scream
and moaning
came
from
from
outside, and they came
Then
from
a
more
small
than one
pirate
place.
leader ran in.
Maybe it was
He said
because
a
of the
few
habit
words
of
outside
working
and someone
at
came in
sunrise
to
and
report,
resting at sunrise.
"Your Excellency,
The
a
Aborigines
slave
basically
dug
had
up a
no other
hibernating
entertainment
snake at
and was
night.
bitten by it. So their only
Monkey
entertainment
drained
at
his
night
blood
was
to
to
expel
expel the poison.
As warriors
but the
with higher status in the tribe, poisonous. They enjoyed more slave food, can't more resources, and more mates. What everything in this area was much better than the outside. Could bite him. There were
The
even
climate of
decorative
the outer
sculptures
islands was
and
tropical.
smoked meat, salted
The winter
fish,
here was
deer
very
legs,
short,
and so on,
and
hanging
many
under
poisonous
the
snakes did
The
not
Aborigines living here
The
were
temperature here was
much
much
higher, and there
They
was
were
basically no
professionals
ice
and
and
had
snow.
strong fighting
But in an
power.
area with such
They
a
were
climate,
supported by
it
the
was easy to
inferior
breed
Aborigines
mosquitoes
and
and had the
snakes.
right to speak in the
Sometimes,
tribe. There was
the
no
number
way
of
to deal
warriors
with these
was uncertain.
environmental factors.
But according to
They could only
Soren's
passively
estimation,
deal
at
with
least
it.
5 people
This
were
was
needed
something
to
that
support
people who
one
had been
warrior.
to primitive
If
forests
this
or
tribe
other
didn't
wild
annex
areas would
other
understand.
tribes,
At most there were
Soren
about
frowned and
300
rubbed his
warriors.
forehead.
In terms
Then
of
he said
numbers,
in a
they
deep
didn't
voice,
pose much of a
"Clean
threat
up
to
this
Soren
area first."
because he brought a
Set
lot
it
of
on fire.
pirates with him.
Get
They
someone
could
to
basically
prepare a fire
participate in
and
the
smoke
battle.
it. However,
scatter
there
the
were a lot
powder.
of old and weak
It should
women and
not rain
children in
today.
this tribe.
As long as it
he got
didn't rain,
closer
it would
and
be
closer
fine.
to the center.
If it did, all
Soren
the powder would go to
inexplicably
waste.
felt a sense of crisis.
Soren's men immediately went to carry out the order
and could see a
then
few
they
tall
saw the
and
slaves
majestic
and pirates
buildings.
clearing the bushes.
One of the
near
buildings
camp.
was very luxurious.
All the weeds and bushes
Even
were
the
cut
ground
down
was
and dug
covered
up
with fur.
Then they
and
set
there were
fire
two tall
to the grass on all
aborigines
sides.
standing in front of the door.
A thick plume of
This
smoke
should be the
rose into
residence of the
sky.
chief of the
Following
indigenous
the
tribe.
spread of the fire
It
and
seemed
the
that the
scattering
living
of the powder,
conditions here were
a
no
dense
worse
swarm
than
of
that of
insects
many
could be
generations
seen
of
burrowing
aristocrats
out from the underbrush.
Soren could also
The sheer
hear the
number
sound
of
of
insects
Megs
was
walking
enough to
around.
make one's scalp
Soren
tingle.
heard the sound of
Many
people and
ferocious
footsteps,
and cruel
but he
pirates
was not
felt
sure what was
goosebumps
going
all
on in
over
their
their
bodies. In addition to this luxurious
a strong
residence,
northern pirate
there was
cursed.
only a large
He couldn't
courtyard
help
nearby.
but tremble and murmured,
The source of
"There are
Soren's
so many
uneasiness
insects
was
down
this
there.
courtyard.
I even
Judging
slept there
from the
last
strange
night.
statues placed
How
in front
many
of the
insects
door
were
and all
there?
kinds of
It
mysterious
wasn't easy to
patterns,
count,
it
but
was
there
no
should be
surprise that
thousands.
this was the place where the shaman lived. Soren felt a weak fluctuation of magic, but he didn't dare to approach because the spellcaster could set up an alarm trap, and this trap was very difficult to remove. It was possible that if he approached slightly, the other party would directly use a magic trap to discover him. There was a very strong smell of medicine near the shaman's courtyard. A very, very strong smell of medicine. The smell was a little pungent and it made people feel a little uncomfortable. It was as if they would be poisoned if they stayed for too long. The nearby houses were quite far from here. It seemed that the other people in the tribe feared the shaman more than they respected him. There were a lot of strange plant roots and body parts near the courtyard. Soren couldn't identify most of them, but this didn't prevent him from confirming that the shaman inside was an expert in potions. At least in the branch of potions, toxicology, he was a first-class expert. The indigenous people were good at using poisons. This kind of knowledge was mainly in the hands of the shaman. They would pass on part of it, but the most important part was passed down orally by the shaman. Because of long-term exposure to potions, many of these shaman had poison resistance, and some even had a body that was directly immune to poison. They also had some abilities similar to dark witchcraft, including some strange curses. There was a row of trees near the courtyard. It was a kind of strange tree about 25 meters tall, and the leaves weren't very wide. It looked like a kind of arbor and the bark was white and gray. Soren glanced at it, and his expression gradually became serious. He quietly approached it, and then a throwing knife appeared in his palm out of thin air. This is... Soren carefully pierced a small hole in the trunk, and then carefully observed it. He only saw a trace of milky white liquid flowing out, and there seemed to be a faint fishy smell in the air. His expression was serious and he murmured, "Throat sealing? Arrow poison wood?" Throat sealing. It was a kind of naturally poisonous tree, and its name was arrow poison wood. It was a kind of tree that was commonly seen in tropical rainforests. When the milky white venom touched the wound, it would quickly paralyze the poisoned person's heart, seal the blood vessels, coagulate the blood, and finally suffocate to death. This kind of poison was very dangerous. If the dose of poison was relatively high, even an extraordinary body may not be able to withstand it. As for the ordinary pirates under Soren, if they were poisoned, they basically needed an antidote, and the probability of surviving was quite low. It seems that my decision was right. Soren couldn't help but have a cold sweat. He secretly rejoiced that he decided to come here personally today, and didn't recklessly let his men fight with the indigenous tribe. Otherwise, when the real fight began, the casualties of his men would definitely be quite heavy. Not to mention the indigenous people's other means, just the throat-sealing poison alone was enough to make many people suffer. Most of Soren's pirates would be dead before they could even see them summon their elemental spirits. It seems that I have to think about it at length. If I want to make a move, I have to catch them off guard. Soren's figure lurked in the darkness. He took a deep look at the courtyard in front of him, then turned and walked out of the tribe. The shaman here was a big problem. If he wanted to deal with the indigenous tribe, he had to carry out a decapitation operation. He and Vivian had to take the first step to get rid of the shaman. Although he couldn't determine the level of his profession, it shouldn't be higher than the 4th grade. Basically, there were very few legendary level shamans in the outer islands. Even if there were, they would be in the large indigenous tribes with tens of thousands of people. This indigenous tribe seemed to have a lot of resources, whether it was population, land, or other materials. Even the arrow poison wood was of great use to Soren. Soren's trip this time. He confirmed the threat of this indigenous tribe, and also confirmed his determination to get rid of them. How could he allow others to sleep beside him? These indigenous people were so dangerous, Soren absolutely couldn't allow them to live on this island. Perhaps the indigenous people's attitude towards outsiders was similar, but because they didn't know Soren's background, they didn't rush to attack. Only one of them was destined to survive. Asterisk 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 P.S. I got up at 6:30 in the morning to write. Maybe I feel that the updates during this period of time are not good enough, so I have to quickly compensate you. Fuda Z, who is working hard to write. Today at 3 o'clock. Chapter 260. Port Tylon. In a tavern near the port, the half-elf first mate was sitting at the bar waiting. Next to him was a prostitute, but he was not interested in looking at her. There was a sign outside the tavern. The sign was painted with a great white shark. There were many people waiting outside. Many of them looked fierce, so ordinary people passing by did not dare to approach. About 10 minutes later, a skinny man came in. He looked around, then turned and went into the tavern. "How is it?" The half-elf first mate glanced at the skinny man who came in and said in a deep voice, "Have you found the person I need?" The skinny man quickly bowed his head and replied, "Because it's near the end of the year, many people have left here. Dwarves have been rare during this time. Maybe it's because of the City of Wealth, now the whole coastal area is a bit depressed." The half-elf first mate frowned and said, "I don't care what the reason is. The person I need must be found for me, or I will throw you into the sea to feed the fish." The skinny man heard the words and had a cold sweat on his forehead. He quickly said, "I will do it as soon as possible. I will do it as soon as possible." However, there are a lot of people who know how to make bricks, but it's very difficult to find someone who's proficient in it. I heard that some slaves were recently shipped from the east, among which there are craftsmen who know how to make porcelain. This batch of slaves seems to be sent here for some reason. Anyway, many people have received the news recently. Some of them will be sent to the City of Wealth for auction, and the other will be sent to the Principality of Rossard. The half-elf first mate showed a look of interest and said slowly, "Eastern slaves? Porcelain?" "Yes." The skinny man quickly nodded and said, "Among the slaves sent from the east, there are many craftsmen who know how to make porcelain. It seems that something big happened over there. Many Easterners were demoted to slaves. Since these people even know how to make such exquisite porcelain, it should be no problem to make simple bricks and tiles. They should be able to meet your requirements." "Porcelain? Slaves?" The half-elf first mate raised his hand and touched his chin as if he was thinking about something. He said slowly, "It seems to be useful. Where are they? You also have to find me the dwarf who built the furnace. You know His Excellency Throat Cutter's temper. If he is unhappy because things are done too slowly, I'm afraid another batch of heads will be cut off in Port Tylon." The skinny man quickly nodded and left after saying a few more words. After he left, the half-elf first mate raised his hand and beckoned to the scarred man next to him. He then ordered, "Go to Snake Island to gather people and prepare a batch of fast boats. Those craftsmen will definitely be useful. Let's go and grab them." They were pirates. Pirates spent money to buy things because they had moral integrity. Robbing them was their professional ethics. Scarface's subordinate quickly nodded and left. The half-elf first mate nodded with satisfaction, and then began to think about how to take down the slaves with the least casualties and the fastest speed. His Excellency Throat Cutter recently needed a lot of labor, and this batch of Eastern slaves seemed to be very valuable. At the other side, after the skinny man left the tavern, he quickly made his way into an alley. He entered from a back door and came to a room. Outside the room, there was a powerful female Amazon warrior guarding. Inside there was a woman with a scar on her face and a dagger. She glanced at the skinny man who came in and asked, "How is it?" "Looks like he took the bait." The skinny man quickly bowed his head. The Amazon woman with a scar on the side of her face showed a smile and said playfully, "Very good. That batch of goods is secretly controlled by the pirate King Ashrod. As long as this group of throat cutters men snatch the goods, their conflicts will soon become more and more intense. The pirate King Ashrod has long felt threatened and dissatisfied with the rise of throat cutter. Now he should make a move, right?" The skinny man quickly nodded and hesitated for a moment before saying, "But that batch of goods seems to have more than just some slaves transported by the way, right? Some of the things in it are very valuable. I'm afraid that they will benefit in the end. And I'm afraid that Ashrod can also guess the information we revealed to them." The Amazon woman looked at him contemptuously and said slowly, "It's just 50 or 60,000 kindlers' goods. If it can make the two pirate kings fight, it's worth paying a little price. That man thinks that he can run rampant on the sea with the support of the Naga royal family behind him. It's not the first time he has done things secretly behind the Sea Temple's back. Now we just have to sit back and reap the benefits. The skinny man didn't speak, but his expression was inexplicably worried. Instigating the struggle between the two pirate kings on the south coast would definitely put a little pressure on him. As long as either side knew, his end would be very miserable. Now he only hoped that after they fought, no one would be in the mood to pay attention to a small character like him. The Outer Islands. Soren returned to the camp at dawn. Vivian seemed to have not slept all night. After feeling that he was back, she closed her eyes sleepily. The little girl was worried that Soren would be in danger. Because she had used limited wishing, the two of them had a telepathic ability. She was ready to teleport at any time when Soren was in danger. Now that Soren was back, she was naturally relieved. The little girl, who had been very sleepy during this time, quickly fell asleep. It was really enviable. The little girl slept most of the time every day, but her strength grew faster than Soren. It was as if sleeping could improve her combat power. After Soren came back, he immediately became busy. On the one hand, he strengthened his vigilance. On the other hand, he also studied how to uproot the indigenous tribes. There were two most troublesome problems in dealing with the indigenous tribes. The first was the spirit that they worshipped and sacrificed. Most of the spirits had legendary combat power, and there was more than one spirit. If the tribe maintained the worship of the ancestors, then the number of spirits might be more. The most powerful of them was probably above the legendary level. The other souls were directly transformed into souls after the death of the high-grade warriors in the tribe. This kind of existence was a bit like the war spirit. It was more common in totemic areas, and it was a common situation in the far north and Iceland. Souls were a bit similar to holy spirits. Both had a weak divine power. It was not that easy to deal with souls. Anything that was related to the power of the gods was not easy to deal with. Even if Soren and Vivian worked together, it would be more troublesome to deal with the souls sacrificed by the indigenous tribes for generations. Secondly, the Aborigines were proficient in the use of poisons and medicines. Whether it was the blow darts that could force people to faint or the poisons and liquids that could be smeared on weapons, these things were quite dangerous and troublesome. Moreover, the speed of these poisons was quite fast. Once you were poisoned, you would fall to the ground in a short time. Soren had a headache dealing with them, not to mention the other pirates. This was the most troublesome thing in the Outer Islands. There were too many poisonous things here. With a little knowledge of potions, it was easy to find the poison things here. Soren frowned and thought, his fingers gently stroking the table. At this moment, the sky was already bright. Because Soren ordered to lift the ban on alcohol and let the pirate minions celebrate the new year, the whole camp was now in a celebratory atmosphere. No matter how fierce the pirates were, they were still humans, and humans would certainly have some other emotions. There was no need for decorations for the new year, but a bonfire had to be set up. Large bowls of wine and large pieces of meat were also necessary. Some of the pirates were prepared to hunt, and some were prepared to go out and fish for seafood. Many of the pirates were fishermen and sailors. Recently, the pirate minions had a little understanding of Soren's eating habits. They knew that the throat cutter liked seafood such as sea cucumbers, shark fins, lobsters, and so on. Even the king crab, which was rarely eaten, was quite liked by him. Many seafood actually had a strong fishy smell. In this era, spices were very expensive. Many people directly boiled the seafood they caught, and there was basically no seasoning. A group of pirates was ready to go to the sea. They planned to catch some rare seafood and bring it back to Soren. But at this moment, suddenly there was a trace of a ship in the distance. It did not look like a warship, and there was no flag on it. The pirate leader under Soren still knew the severity of the situation. After seeing the ship in the distance, he immediately ordered his minions to go back and report. Then they sent out a fast boat and rowed towards the approaching ship in the distance, ready to inquire about the identity of the other party. But it seemed that they did not need to ask, because the pirate leader had just approached and recognized who the person in front of him was. The other party had two obvious characteristics, such as black skin, silver-white hair, and scarlet pupils. Drows. Strictly speaking, they should be half-drows of mixed blood. Standing on the bow was the drow warrior that Soren let go. Behind him was a whole team of drow warriors. Although their equipment looked a little worse and many of them had some traces of damage, they were much stronger than the pirates. The pirate leader in front of him was stunned for a moment, but he did not stop them to ask. He just let the team of drows in front of him go ashore. On this day, after waiting for more than a month, Soren finally received a response from the drows. However, the time was much later than he expected.
Chapter 261. The City of Wealth. The shadows left by the chaos and killings that happened some time ago have not yet dissipated, and the city was still a bit deserted. There were not many pedestrians on the streets, and now a lot of trade has turned to Shipwreck Bay. So much so that the life of the lower class of the City of Wealth has become difficult. In the past, there were endless jobs to be found on the docks at this time, but now the docks had to be picky. Many families who relied on selling coolies to live were now very poor. Especially because of the arrival of the new year and the spread of chaos within the mainland, the gradually increasing food prices made them even more miserable. Many people have regretted it. Many people lost their relatives and friends that night, but after that night they found that they lost more than that. The paladins left. They actually succeeded in changing the place and reducing the evil here, but they did not let the poor live the life they wanted because they were weak and the weak were so fragile after the chaos. The gang forces in the City of Wealth have been reduced a lot. Many gangs were destroyed that night, but the destroyed gangs left a lot of empty spaces, and too many bloody incidents have occurred in the fight for these interests. From that day until now, the curfew in the City of Wealth has not been lifted, and there are many guards patrolling every day. The temple also seemed a bit silent. They don't seem to have any plans to do anything about the City of Wealth that is gradually losing its former prosperity. Maybe they have already done something or made other decisions. No one knows what the temple is planning. Maybe they don't care about this temporary depression, but for the poor at the bottom, they only know that life is getting harder and harder. Food prices are still rising, work opportunities are getting fewer and fewer, and the merchants who come here no longer provide economic consumption. Even the business of prostitutes and female prostitutes has begun to deteriorate a lot. In the past, 2 silver thalers could get a pretty prostitute, but now 1 silver thaler could be played twice, and even let her open her mouth to taste the flute for a while. At the corner of the street, 2 shop owners with some sad faces sat together. One of the chubby shop owners raised his hand to wipe his sweat and complained, "I heard that there is going to be a war in the south. Recently the price of goods has increased by 30%, and there are fewer things being shipped from the south. I heard that some trade routes have been cut off. I also heard that the Red Dragon appeared in Whiterun, and now everyone is in a panic." The other shop owner, who was skinnier, also sighed and said slowly, "That's not too bad. We could have taken the sea route. But now, after such a commotion, many merchants did not dare to come over. I heard that there's a pirate king named Throat Cutter in Port Tylon and Shipwreck Bay. He's different from the previous pirate kings. He doesn't like to take his men to rob, and he restricts others from acting recklessly. Now, many merchants are running to these 2 places." The fat shop owner was stunned for a moment before he asked, "Not robbing? Then where would his money come from? There are many pirates who make a living on the sea. If they don't rob, won't they all have to starve?" The skinny shop owner looked outside and replied, "I'm not sure either. But there must be other ways to earn money." It was said that some of the pirate leaders had changed professions and started a caravan. In addition to the filial piety on the surface of the sea, it would definitely be enough to feed a group of subordinates. Besides, most of the trade on the south coast was supported by the outer islands. That's a lot of money. TSK, 1 ticket is enough for us to earn in 2 or 3 years. That's right. I heard during this period of time that His Excellency Throat Cutter did not rob merchants at all. Recently, Port Tylon and Shipwreck Bay have heard that they are selling flags. It's a big black flag. It's said that pirates on the sea will not attack merchant ships if they hang it up. Those who don't hang flags are a bit uncertain. Anyway, I'm not too sure. The world has changed too fast recently. Something will happen every few days. I've been very worried recently. I'm wondering if I should sell my shop, and then make some preparations to go back to the manor in the countryside." The 2 men kept chatting and they talked too much about recent events. Suddenly, they seemed to have heard a scream and then their whole body shivered. There was a lot of chaos during this period of time. The day before yesterday, someone was hacked to death in front of their shop in the middle of the night. The 2 men did not dare to go over when they heard the sound. Instead, they hurriedly called the patrol guards. It took about 10 minutes for the guards to come over. There was no movement in the alley where the sound came from. However, this was also good. People who didn't see anything, didn't hear anything, and didn't know anything could live longer. As soon as they entered the alley, even the patrol guards could not help but take a deep breath. There were many corpses inside. One of the guard captains with a beard and full body armor turned over and looked at the corpses. The expression on his face suddenly became serious. He looked around and said, "It's a very powerful master. These corpses were all killed in one blow. The time of death was less than a minute.
Such a powerful master has probably crossed that threshold. This is not something we can control. Let's report it and let the higher-ups deal with it. There were 12 corpses on the ground. All of them were killed in one blow. The time of death was less than a minute. The last scream seemed to be because of something else. Otherwise there was no movement at all. This was already the combat power of a legendary level. Not to mention that the guard captain just took a look and found that there were adventurers with similar skills as him among the corpses. 3 of them were at least grade 3 professions. The matter was quickly reported, but it was hard to say whether anyone would care about it next. On the other side, on a hidden beam, a young man in a cloak sat in the corner of the house. He was playing with a golden gold coin in his hand. His expression seemed to be a little excited. The gold coin in his hand was quite special. It was not in the style of Kindler. There was no portrait of the Lady of Riches on it. Instead, it was engraved with the image of another goddess. There were strange patterns on the front and back of the gold coin. Many of them could not be understood at all, but it did not affect people who saw it at first sight. The young man stood up, picked up the gold coin, and smiled in the direction of the sea. My luck is really good. This time, not only did I get a big order, but I also happened to meet someone who found the legendary lucky gold coin in the underground ruins. It seems that the Lady of Luck is really looking after me this time. Throat cutter? If I kill you, I will have a big harvest this time. Chapter 262. From the desolate desert to the east, across the boundless Gobi, into the fortress surrounded by mountains. A young man in tattered armor was walking alone. He had just finished a battle and dealt with an ogre that was wandering nearby. At this moment he was wiping the blood on his sword, then he put his sword back into the scabbard and walked toward the fortress surrounded by mountains. The fortress was built halfway up the mountain. It was undoubtedly very time-consuming to build at such a height and in such an environment. This place seemed to have a very long history. Just by looking at it, one could feel the vicissitudes of the fortress. There were some black marks on the walls, which were the blood that seeped into the rocks and finally became what it was now. The young man took a deep breath and then slowly stepped into the fortress. No one seemed to be surprised by his arrival, and no one stopped him from entering. He walked all the way to the center of the fortress. There were 6 marble pillars in the hall, and there were almost no other decorations. There were some relief paintings on the walls and it looked quite empty. At the front of the long table sat a rather burly man. He had a standard square face, a strong heroic spirit, clean short hair, thick eyebrows and a rather sharp gaze. The man was wearing heavy armor and had a 2-handed heavy sword on his knees. When he heard the footsteps of others, he could not help but raise his head slightly and put down the quill in his hand. In front of him were piles of scrolls, which were almost a meter thick. Many of them had been flipped through and put aside. It seemed that he had been sitting here for a long time. Next to him was the food he had eaten at noon, which was just very simple bread and soup. You're here. The burly man stood up. He was probably more than 2 meters tall, much taller than the young man in front of him. He put down the quill pen in his hand and also put down the book in his hand. His sharp and heroic eyes stared at the young man in front of him. Time did not leave too many traces on his face, but his chiseled and resolute face still made others feel the traces of time he had experienced. This was a profession above legendary. Powerful strength had transformed his bloodline, and his lifespan was much longer than ordinary people. The young man knelt down on one knee and humbly lowered his head. He held the top of the sword hilt and said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency, Judge." The burly man didn't answer. He just quietly looked at the young man in front of him. After a while he slowly walked down and came to the front of this former Saint Samurai. He pulled out his sword and placed it on his shoulder. He said in a deep voice, "Since you have the qualifications to come to me, it proves that you have passed all the previous tests. I don't know what you've been through, what you've seen, or what you've understood. None of this is important to me. The important thing is that from today onwards, you have to learn to look at the world from a different perspective. Now, I want to teach you your first lesson." The tall and sturdy man picked up a heavy book and handed it to the young man in front of him, saying in a sonorous voice, "Justice, either by force or by law. From today onwards, you will follow me and learn all the laws of the continent. Once you've learned all the laws, I'll teach you how to use force to seek justice. Young people, you have to remember that force is always the last resort. You have to learn to use your wisdom before using force. The law is also our most effective weapon. even if we have to use force to maintain the law in the end. Judge. A former Saint Samurai who was almost forgotten by history. Many people had completely forgotten this legendary Saint Samurai. However, if Soren were present, he would recognize that the tall and sturdy man in front of him was a more powerful and special existence than the Silver Hand. Not many people still remembered his past, but Soren knew that he was one of the few legendary professions in the world who had the ability to fight against powerful gods. He was also the only Saint Samurai who dared to draw his sword against the God of Light. The City of Wealth. In a dark basement, a woman with a grimace mask frowned and shouted coldly at the others below. What? The lucky gold coins were stolen? You bunch of useless trash. Hurry up and get them back for me. The angry voice was like a cold wind blowing, making the others below tremble. One of the men couldn't help but muster up his courage and whisper, Your Excellency, please calm down. According to the prophecy, we must gather all 12 lucky gold coins to unlock the secret of that place. We still have time. We must have time to get the lucky gold coins back. The woman with the grimace mask looked at him coldly and said slowly, I'll give you half a year. If you can't get the lucky gold coins back after half a year, then you can talk to His Excellency the Saint in person. Lucky gold coins. A legendary special item that was said to bring good luck to people. There were a total of 12 lucky gold coins. The front was engraved with the oldest goddess of luck, not the current goddess of luck. The back was engraved with 12 astrological signs, representing different meanings. There were very few records about the lucky gold coins. It was only known that they could bring good luck. However, there was also a special legend. It was said that after gathering all 12 lucky gold coins, one could find the 13th gold coin that represented misfortune and bad luck. This was a very ancient artifact. It could even be used to curse the gods. It was an artifact made by the goddess of luck for self-protection. The Outer Islands. Soren didn't have much joy on his face for the appearance of the drow warrior, because the other party arrived much later than he expected. According to his original plan, the drow should have arrived before he set off for the Outer Islands, instead of waiting until he had set up a camp in the Outer Islands. A team of drow warriors appeared in the distance. Although their equipment was a bit shabby, their momentum was very strong. There were only 31 drows, but their neat pace and cold eyes were more shocking than hundreds of pirates. These drow warriors were easy to associate with the elven army in The Lord of the Rings. Among the warriors of many races, the discipline of the elves was the best, and among all the elves, the rule of the drow army was the most cruel and ruthless. The training time of an elven warrior was quite long, far more time-consuming than that of warriors of other races. So in terms of quality in all aspects, the elven army was one of the best. As for the drow warriors, they were even stricter. The training they received was far more than that of other races. All of them were professions above grade 3. Soren just glanced at the drow warriors in front of him and inferred their abilities. Almost all of them had the combat power of a pirate leader. This kind of combat power could be a patrol captain in a city on the surface, but in the Underdark they could only be a more elite patrol guard. They were not even qualified to apply to be a petrified lizard knight. It seemed that their race had weakened a lot. Soren couldn't see many grade 4 drow warriors among them. The strict standard for a drow warrior in the Underdark was a profession level of 15. Your Excellency. The leader of the drow warriors seemed to intend to show his strength. After stopping, he turned around. The drow warriors behind him also turned around neatly at the same time. There was no movement during this period. Everyone seemed to be one. This might seem very shocking and oppressive to the pirates, but Soren was used to it. In his previous life, the discipline of military parades was child's play. Perhaps their fighting power was not as good as these drow warriors, but in terms of formation he had seen more shocking things. Soren nodded indifferently and said slowly, The others stay outside. You come in with me. I have something to talk to you about. These drow warriors came at the right time. Soren just needed such a group of thugs. P.S. I'm a little slow today. I can only write 2 chapters. Chapter 263. The sky gradually darkened. Darkblade did not look very good when he walked out of the hall. The drow warriors he brought had been settled in another residence. When he returned, there were already people waiting for him. These drows did not seem to be completely at ease with Soren. They were still fully armed after settling down, just waiting quietly for the return of their leader. Drows were very suspicious, intelligent creatures. It was difficult for them to trust others in a short time. How is it? A young-looking drow warrior stood up and asked, "Lord Dark Blade, what did that lord say?" Dark Blade looked at the others and noticed that they also wanted to know what Lord Dark Blade asked for. In the end, he could only sigh helplessly. "He wants us to serve him and fight for him. As long as we can do this, the tribe can get a steady stream of supplies. He even promised to let us move here to live." These words made many people silent. At first glance, it sounded like a good condition, but after careful consideration, it was suspicious of annexation. The drows did not want to be controlled by a human. Cooperation was the limit they could accept at present. Unless Soren was so powerful that they could not resist or refuse, and could easily erase their existence. Before coming here, the female priests had made a decision. In fact, the group of women was still a little disgusted and distrustful of human beings. Otherwise, the leader would not be a male drow. It was important to know that males were naturally inferior to females among the drows. Lord Dark Blade. A young drow warrior hesitated and said slowly, "Didn't we think this would happen before we came? After all, there is no free food in the world. He will definitely need us to pay something. If it's just fighting for him, it's not a big deal for us. After all, it's not the first time we've dealt with the natives." What was the most abundant in the outer islands? The natives. This group of drows had fought with the natives more than once or twice. Basically, in the outer islands, where the living environment was slightly better and the surrounding materials and food were richer, there would be large or small native tribes. They had mastered many ways to deal with the indigenous people in this cruel environment. After all, they were drows, which were equally dangerous and evil creatures. Even if they gave up their faith in the Queen of Spiders, there was still a trace of cunning and cruelty in the nature of the drows. "I know." Dark Blade looked at the others and slowly said, "But this lord wants to directly attack and destroy the aboriginal tribe." His words caused a huge uproar. The other drows could not help but widen their eyes and murmur, "Master Dark Blade, didn't you tell His Excellency what was in the indigenous tribe? Those spirits are rather difficult to deal with, and they don't have bodies of flesh and blood. When we first encountered them, we suffered heavy losses. With the pirates in the camp, it's basically impossible to defeat the spirits, unless there's a relatively powerful spell caster. The drows had also fought against the native spirits. However, there was no doubt that they had failed. It was because they were not strong enough and also because there were too many enemies. Without the power of the adepts and priests, it was very difficult for a group of powerful melee warriors to kill the half-energy soul lifeforms. Right. Spirits were immune to any attack from non-rare weapons. If it was a spirit with the power of a demigod, it would be immune to any rare weapon attack below grade 3. Its immunity was not much different from that of a demigod lich, but it did not have the powerful physical damage reduction ability of a demigod lich. After all, a lich's body was just a skeleton. In the entire camp, if they encountered a demigod spirit, except for Soren's legendary curved sword, Icing Death, no other weapon could hurt it. One could imagine how passive this group of drows with simple equipment was at that time. It was almost a one-sided situation when facing the spirits. In many cases, there was no way around it. It was like if you didn't have Dragon Slayer equipment, sometimes you couldn't break the defense of a giant dragon. "I've said it." Dark Blade looked at the others and said in a deep voice, but His Excellency's attitude was quite firm, and I didn't dare to reject him obviously. After all, you know the situation of the tribe now. It's definitely not a wise choice to anger a pirate king. But fortunately, the indigenous tribes here are much weaker than the ones we encountered. The population is estimated to be only more than 1,000. According to the customs of the indigenous people who participate in hunting are considered warriors, there should only be about 300 people who can fight. The indigenous warriors did not participate in farming or labor. In addition to regular hunting and fighting, they were all supported by the lower-level indigenous people. The leader of the drows looked at the others and said slowly, "His Excellency said that he was sure to deal with the spirits, so our task is to assist the pirates to deal with the indigenous people." There was a short silence. A drow's warrior who looked not young stood up and said in a deep voice, "If His Excellency can deal with the spirits, we are not afraid of those indigenous people. According to the time, it's almost time for the antelopes and horned zebras to migrate. During this time, all the indigenous tribes are hunting. The source of meat for next spring depends on this hunt. So they should not launch an attack for the time being. Maybe we can choose a good time to attack them. If we are lucky, the casualties will be reduced a lot." The outer islands were a bit similar to Africa. Many of the islands here were scattered, but there were also connected islands because it used to be a continental shelf. The creatures in the jungle also had the habit of migrating north and south. When migration occurred, the number of herds would be quite large. Sometimes they would encounter migrating elephant herds. This was the hunting season for the indigenous tribes. Most of their meat for the coming year came from here. The indigenous people would use sea salt to cure the meat, which could be maintained for a long time until the next autumn's fishing season. The fishing season was the migration of fish. Sturgeon, swordfish, striped fish, and so on would go to warm areas to reproduce every autumn and return to areas near the north in the spring of the next year. During this period, the number of fish was quite spectacular. You could see a large number of fish on the migration route of the fish with the naked eye. Simply put, you could catch dozens of fat fish by throwing a big net down. And because the fishermen did not hunt much, these fish were very clumsy and could be speared with a harpoon. In some ways, the resources of the outer islands were indeed very rich. Knowledge geography. The outer islands as a whole are a narrow island-connected area. The length reaches the scale of the continental shelf, but the width is less than 1/10. The edge of the Gulf Islands will extend to the extreme north, and eventually close to the Great Glacier that stretches for thousands of miles. On the other side, Soren walked back and forth in the hall, then looked up at his men in front of him and said, "Pay attention to the drows. If there are any changes, tell me immediately." "Yes." A scarred man immediately responded and left. Just as the drows could not fully trust Soren, Soren did not fully trust them because he had dealt with the drows more than once or twice. He knew a lot about these intelligent creatures that were cunning by nature. If you wanted to control the drows, you either had power or benefits. Otherwise they would easily betray you. Soren closed his eyes and took a deep breath, then said, "No female drows appeared and no spellcasters were seen. Has this group of drows declined to such a state, or have they still not decided to fully cooperate with me? If it's because of me, their value will be greatly reduced. A group of drows that has lost their spellcaster inheritance has no future. If it's the latter, then they still feel repulsed by me. I'm afraid they can only cooperate because they have no other choice. I must have great power to completely tame them, right?" This group of drows was very valuable. If they were included in Soren's plan, it could achieve twice the result with half the effort. Besides, the drows were naturally suited to do some shady things. Soren had many means that the pirates might not be able to do, but these drows could definitely do it. He must capture these drows in his hands. P.S. Today's update. Chapter 264. The sky was just starting to brighten. Soren had already woken up. He washed up and went to the training ground outside his room to stretch his muscles. Soren's mastery of sword forms had once again entered a period of accumulation. He was now practicing the White Raven tactics. It was much harder to master compared to sword forms. He had been practicing it for a few months, but he still hadn't made much progress. Under normal circumstances, it would take 3 to 5 years to master a portion of these high-level combat skills. Sword forms belong to a single attack, while the White Raven tactics belong to a set of attacks. It was like the difference between a powerful sword form and a set of powerful sword forms. There were also techniques for explosive power, techniques for accumulating power, and techniques for combining attacks. These things required specialized training and mastering the corresponding skills. For example, Soren couldn't immediately use sword form decapitation after using heavy slash. Only sword saints could master these techniques. There were many combat skills that only they could use. Soren exercised for a while and the sky gradually brightened. He took out a 3-shot crossbow and quickly loaded it with ammunition. He then fired at a target 100 meters away. The distance wasn't too far, but it wasn't too close either. Soren didn't even aim. He just raised his hand and fired at the target. With his current strength and attributes, he didn't need to aim. His accuracy was quite high. All attribute abilities extended to various fields, so attribute abilities were also the most difficult to improve. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. All 3 arrows hit the target and all of them hit the bullseye. However, there was no trace of pride on Soren's face because this was just the simplest shooting skill. This kind of skill was nothing in the eyes of many people. He calmly continued to load the crossbow and ran from left to right. He moved at an astonishing speed and at the same time he fired at the target in the distance. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. All 3 arrows hit the target, but this time only one of them hit the bullseye. Soren looked at the target in front of him and couldn't help but frown slightly. He hadn't mastered any skills in long-range shooting. It wasn't easy to hit the target while moving at high speed. He had to rely on his strong dexterity attributes, balance, coordination, hit rate, etc. However, this was really nothing. A true expert could directly shoot the heart of the target while moving at high speed while the enemy was also moving at high speed. Only then could he be considered a true godly archer. If it was a sharpshooter according to the standards of ordinary people, then most of the elves who were good at crossbows could do it. The conditions were still not enough. Without modern training equipment, high-speed shooting had to be mastered in actual combat. Soren played with the 3-shot crossbow in his hand. Then he loaded it and fired. There was a burst of applause in the distance, and then the drow that Soren had let go came over. His name was Dark Blade Andri. He was a master of combat among the drow and the leader of the drow warriors. There were 2 people behind the drow warrior. He looked at Soren in front of him and bowed slightly. He then praised, "Your skills are amazing." Was a little fake. Soren knew his shooting skills, but his face didn't change at all. He just smiled and said, "It's just a casual practice. Drows are the masters of shooting." Dark Blade Andri smiled and then said, "Do you like to use crossbows?" "Yes." Soren frowned slightly. He didn't quite understand why the other party said this. The leader of the drow warriors in front of him glanced at the target in the distance, then lowered his head slightly and said, "In my opinion, with your strength, you shouldn't use such a heavy and slow crossbow at all. Only some people who are not talented enough are suitable to use a crossbow because it takes too long to load, and its power is not stronger than a bow. From my personal point of view, your strength, agility, and physical fitness are far superior to others. From the perspective of an archer, you are a genius in using a bow." Genius? Soren couldn't help but show a thoughtful expression. In terms of attributes, he did have quite enough attributes to use a bow. It was just that he had always used a crossbow before, and it had become a habit, so he almost never thought about switching to a bow. Until today, when the leader of the drow warriors in front of him mentioned it, Soren realized that with his current attributes, using a bow might be better than using a crossbow. "Come." Dark Blade Andri turned around and looked behind him, then ordered, "Bring me my elven war bow." One of his subordinates quickly left. After a while he came back with a dark golden elven war bow. The surface of the bow was very smooth and there were exquisite carvings on it. It looked like it was painted with some kind of dye, but Soren wasn't too sure what it was. This elven war bow was not an ordinary item at first glance. In fact, all elven war bows were not ordinary items. They were at least +1 rare grade weapons. This was because the bows made by the elves were more sophisticated than those made by humans. The craftsmanship and materials used could not be compared. Elven war bow, +2, rare grade item. Dark Blade Andri handed the elven war bow in his hand to Soren and said slowly, "Why don't you try this war bow? Maybe you will find that a bow is more effective than a crossbow." Soren reached out and took the elven war bow. In the past, his way of fighting was to fill the crossbow with ammunition in advance, and then throw it away when the battle was over. In fact, Soren rarely filled the crossbow with ammunition continuously in battle. He only used it as a one-time consumable. However, today the words of the drows in front of him had attracted his attention. He also wanted to test the lethality of the elven war bow. The follower next to him quickly brought over a quiver full of arrows. Soren stood about 120 meters away from the target, then reached out and picked up an arrow. He smoothly knocked the arrow on the bow and shot it at the target. He didn't use the bow much, but it was not that he was completely unfamiliar with it. It was just that it was not as convenient to shoot as a crossbow. After all, a crossbow could be fired after it was loaded, but there was a process of knocking the arrow on the bow. However, the continuity of shooting with a bow was undoubtedly much better than with a crossbow. Swoosh! A sharp arrow was released, and Soren easily hit the bull's eye. His strength wasn't high, but his dexterity was 24 points. This meant that Soren's balance and coordination were very good. He was very outstanding in anything related to skill. This arrow didn't mean anything. Soren was just trying out his skills. When he got a feel for it, he raised his hand and took the quiver, then he continuously shot at the target in front of him. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. 5 arrows were shot out in succession. Soren's shooting speed was quite fast. Although his strength wasn't very high, his endurance was quite good. It took him about a second to aim and shoot. In other words, he shot continuously for 5 seconds at the target at a rate of 1 arrow per second. In the next moment, 5 arrows pierced through the air and hit the bullseye in the distance. He didn't seem to be unaccustomed to using a bow. Perhaps it was because of the omnipotent hands, his accuracy was very high when he aimed and shot. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. Soren didn't stop at all. He had a total of 30 arrows in his quiver. He shot 10 arrows at each target, which took him about 36 seconds. During this period of time, he didn't need to rest, and he didn't have any stamina that couldn't keep up with the consumption. When he finished shooting all the arrows in his quiver, he felt a slight numbness in his arm. The targets in the distance were full of arrows. Soren basically didn't miss the target, but only 27 arrows hit the bull's eye. 3 of them didn't hit the bull's eye. From the angle of aiming and shooting, this result should be considered pretty good. The drow next to him was slightly surprised. On the other hand, Soren looked at the targets in the distance that were full of arrows and couldn't help but fall into deep thought. He seemed to have overlooked something in the past. Perhaps the crossbow wasn't suitable for him. Chapter 265. Soren needed a long-range attack. Because in the past he often followed a team, but now he was mainly alone. Wizards had too few spell slots. It was unrealistic to rely on spell slots for long-range attacks unless one was a high-grade wizard. Soren used to use a crossbow, but now he thought that a bow was more suitable for him. However, there was also a limitation to this equipment. That was, to use the bow he must carry a quiver on his back. At the same time, if there was a close combat, the bow must be carried on his back. In that case, a turn would be fatal. One could imagine rolling and dodging with a bow on his back. In some ways, a bow was not as convenient as a crossbow. But Soren did not have these concerns, because he had a piece of equipment that he had never had before. It was the Battlemaster gloves. As long as he had this equipment, he could switch weapons at any time. Using a crossbow was as convenient as using a bow. He could take out and put back the bow at any time, and then take out his curved sword to fight in close combat. In other words, this equipment solved the problem of Soren using a bow before, and it also perfectly solved the problem of the bow affecting his performance in close combat. Soren found another way to fight, but he was not in a hurry to change his way of fighting. The reason was simple. Using a bow required a considerable amount of skill, and at the same time, it also required the support of a variety of abilities. He only had high attributes and did not have any abilities. Maybe he could deal with ordinary people, but it would be difficult for him to hit the enemy with a high-grade profession. If he wanted to use a bow to fight, he at least needed to master the abilities of precise shooting, moving shooting, and eagle eye. Very interesting. Soren returned the elven bow in his hand to the drow in front of him and nodded slightly. Your suggestion is very good. It is indeed useful to me. Dark Blade bowed slightly, but he did not reach out to take the elven bow. Instead, he bowed his head and said, "That would be my pleasure. Your Excellency, I think this bow is more suitable for you. In the future you will be able to exert its greatest power. Please accept it." Soren smiled slightly when he heard this. He nodded and put it away. It was a grade 2 extraordinary bow. Moreover, it was an elven war bow. Although it was not as valuable as legendary equipment, it was still relatively rare. At the moment there was not enough special wood to make bows, short bows, long bows, and so on. Most of them were +1 rare grade items. This was similar to the enhanced crossbow. Tier 2 extraordinary ranged weapons were already relatively rare, and Tier 3 extraordinary ranged weapons were even rarer. The most powerful crossbow Soren had ever seen was a +3 heart-piercing bow. He had heard of legendary crossbows before, but he had never seen one before. The increase in the power of the crossbow was mainly due to the arrows and bolts. Item type: Elven War Bow, +2, item grade: Rare, grade 2. Item description: This is an elven war bow with a certain history. It was made with wood from the ancient war tree and took 3 years to make. It has tenacity and durability far surpassing other war bows. The surface of the war bow was engraved with strange patterns. This was the symbol of enchantment, but it was unknown why the maker did not complete the enchantment process. At the bottom of the war bow, there was a sword mark that had been repaired. Its history was unknown, but it was still a powerful elven war bow. Requirements: 12 S-tier. A strength requirement +2. Weapon effect: hard bow, continuous shot, +2 penetration, +1 armor break. It seemed like this elven war bow had some history. Soren looked at it and was slightly surprised. If this elven war bow was completed, it should have its own name, but it seemed like it was not completed for some reason. He touched the engravings on the body of the bow. They did look like engravings left behind by enchantment, but since it was not completed, it was only a grade 2 elven war bow. This weapon is not bad. It even has the effect of armor break. Soren looked at it and thought to himself, the power of the bow mainly depends on the arrow. Although there are no explosive arrows or frost arrows in the outer islands, there are a lot of tools that are dipped in poison. As long as we destroy the indigenous tribe, we can directly use the poison on the arrows in the future. It should not be a problem to mass-produce poisoned arrows. The blow darts used by the indigenous people could reach +3 extraordinary level. If they used their poison skills to make arrows, they might be able to make +3 poisoned arrows. Then, with the help of the elven war bow, the power would be more terrifying. It would definitely be more useful than many spells. At this time, the sky was already bright, and many people had already woken up. Soren just wanted to say something, but he saw a one-eyed pirate coming from outside. He carefully walked to Soren's side and said respectfully, "Your Excellency, it's ready." "Okay." Soren nodded. He looked at the leader of the drow warriors in front of him and said in a deep voice, "We'll attack tonight. Tell your people to get ready." "So fast?" Dark Blade hesitated, but he still nodded and said, "Yes. I'll arrange it now." Soren smiled with satisfaction, then waved his hand to summon one of his men. He whispered a few words in his ear, and then said a few words to the one-eyed pirate. Immediately the two men ran in different directions. Soon the camp began to operate. All the elite pirates under the pirate leaders gathered, but they did not enter the jungle area. Instead they all went to the port and boarded the warships outside. There was a river on this island that led to the sea. They could approach the indigenous tribe from the estuary. In the room. When Soren walked in, Vivian was already dressed and waiting for him. When she saw him come in, the little girl smiled sweetly, but her expression was a little excited. She said in a clear voice, "Brother, let's go. Kill all those nasty aborigines." Today Vivian was wearing a black princess dress. For some reason, the little girl liked to wear black and white princess dresses recently. She rarely wore other clothes. Maybe it was because he gradually got used to the little girl's gradually changing clothes. Soren did not feel strange in his heart. He just nodded slightly and said, "Do you remember all the things I taught you? The most important thing for a spellcaster is to protect yourself. Remember not to be too impulsive. Our goal is those souls. As long as we kill the souls, we can deal with the other indigenous people at any time." The souls were the key to everything. Because whether it was for Soren or Vivian, killing the souls could increase their divine power. As long as the souls were killed, the threat of the indigenous people would be reduced by half, and they could deal with them at any time in the future. Moreover, Soren had now accumulated 9 divinity points. As long as he casually killed a soul with divinity, he could accumulate 10 divinity points and get the buff of minor divinity. At that time, Soren's all attributes would be +1, which was equivalent to an additional 6 points of total attributes. This was quite a huge increase in combat power. Hearing Soren's order, Vivian nodded obediently and then said cheerfully, "Brother, when are we leaving? I can't wait to show off my skills." He did not know why. Soren felt that the little girl was more belligerent than before, but he still liked this change. Because as the Avatar crisis was getting closer and closer, Soren's pressure in his heart was increasing, especially when the future enemies were likely to be gods. He might not be able to protect Vivian's safety at all times, so it was definitely right to let the little girl have a little more strength to protect herself. Fighting also required courage. If she did not even have the courage to face killing, then fighting would become a joke. Soren nodded gently and said in a deep voice, "We'll leave in a while, we'll go by sea. P.S. There are 2 more updates today but the time may be late. I just went to eat." Chapter 266. Under the Dark Night Sky. A warship with black sails entered the island's river from the estuary. Soren was quite patient. He waited until it was dark before he quietly approached the indigenous tribe's territory. This time he did not bring many people. Even with the drow warriors, there were only 121 people. Most of the pirate minions were left in the camp. Because to achieve the effect of a surprise attack, there must be few people and they must be strong. Only an elite force could catch the enemy off guard. The night was getting darker. Soren and his men disembarked from the ship 10 kilometers away from the indigenous tribe. This distance was just right. If they were too close, it would be easy to alert the enemy. If they were too far away, it would be inconvenient to travel in the night. This time, most of the men Soren brought out were strange. They either had many scars on their faces and necks, holes in their ears, or strange tattoos all over their bodies. More than 70% of these guys were fierce-looking pirates. There was no doubt that they were also the elites among the pirates who had survived many battles. The pirate profession was the survival of the fittest. Basically, after 3 battles, the pirates who could survive would not be too weak. In this case, the pirates could improve their strength very quickly. After all, they were originally professionals. The pirates Soren brought out this time were all grade 2 and above. Among them, there were also 20% of the leaders around grade 3. These pirates were far better than ordinary pirates in terms of combat experience and equipment skills. The pirates' equipment was basically private. Soren did not have to pay for their equipment. They would use the bounty to buy equipment themselves. The worst of these pirates had exquisitely forged military weapons. Some of the leaders also had rare grade 1 weapons. Then the drow warriors came down from the ship. They looked much better than when they first came. This was because Soren had replenished their equipment. Before he came, he had prepared a large number of standard military weapons, enough to equip nearly 300 people. This also included some leather armor and inlaid iron armor. As for better armor, it was difficult to get, mainly because the higher the price of armor, the higher the price. The price of a full-body armor would even make Soren's heart ache. Now all the drow warriors were wearing new leather armor, and nearly a third of their weapons had been replaced. After all, Soren had taken A+2 elven warbow from them, so he had to give them something in return. He was a very fair person. The overall strength of the people brought this time was very strong. Drows had quite strong night vision and basically had no problem fighting at night. After all, there was not much light in the Underdark. Most of these drows were albino elves and half-elves, and they still had infrared vision in the dark. Then there were the pirates that were brought over. Basically, there was no possibility of night blindness, so during a night raid their combat power would not be reduced too much. Stop. Soren looked at the others behind him, then gave Vivian a look and said slowly, "We killed their scouts last time, so I'm afraid they'll be prepared. I'll go check if there are any hidden sentries." After that, he nodded to the others, and his whole body disappeared into the darkness. Soren's figure was completely covered by the night. After he entered stealth, he approached the indigenous tribe in front of him, and the people he brought over stayed nearly 3 kilometers away. Remove the hidden sentries. This was the most common job for rogues, and Soren was good at finding hidden sentries. There was a glimmer of light in front of him. Soren approached carefully along the edge of the road. He did not enter the tribe but very cautiously circled around. Soon he felt a slight movement coming from the bushes in the southwest. It was also very difficult to keep watch at night. The indigenous people could not stay still all night. Soren quietly crept over from the side, and then saw a skinny indigenous person crawling among them. The indigenous people of the outer islands were short, a bit like the indigenous people of Indonesia. They were often jokingly called indigenous monkeys by pirates. Soren lurked with no expression. When the distance was about 15 meters, he suddenly began to accelerate, but there was no sound. A faint cold light appeared, and Soren directly rushed over. He stretched out his hand to cover the other person's mouth and nose, and at the same time, his sword pierced through the back of the other person's heart and came out directly from the chest. A stream of blood came out, and the indigenous person that Soren blocked twitched, and then turned into a corpse. A row of cold data appeared. The battle is over. You launched backstab at the target. Caused 86 piercing damage. You hit the target's heart. Triggered fatal damage test. Target's fortitude test failed. Target died. You've gained 1750 slaughter EXP. Although Soren did not scan the strength of the indigenous people, according to the slaughter EXP, he could still roughly judge the opponent's profession level, which should be around grade 3. Due to the lack of knowledge of civilization and not too many sorcerer bloodlines, there were very few spellcasters among the indigenous people. Most of the spellcasters were concentrated in the shamans. However, there were some people here who could control psionic abilities, and under normal circumstances, they would not appear in such a small tribe. It should be a large tribe with tens of thousands of people. The proportion of psionic abilities was probably much smaller than the proportion of sorcerers. Plop. A very slight sound. Soren put down the corpse in his hand, and then covered it a little bit with the grass. Then he went into stealth mode again and moved along the indigenous tribe. Since he had found the hidden sentry, there must be more than one. There must be other indigenous people nearby. Soren, who was in stealth mode, was very careful. After circling around and finding nothing, he began to expand the area and continue to search. Because if there was a hidden sentry that was not taken out and found them in advance, the effect of a sneak attack in the night would be greatly reduced,
and they might even suffer heavy losses here. He was very patient. After circling around 3 times in a row, Soren finally found the second hidden sentry. It was actually hiding in a big tree near the south. If it was not for his sharp hearing, it would be really difficult to find it. Soren spent a whole hour to take out 3 hidden sentry outside the indigenous tribe. When he was sure that there were no more hidden sentry nearby, he went back to the place where he started. It was close to 1 o'clock in the morning. He entered the island river from the sea after it was completely dark. Along the way he cleaned up the hidden sentry. It was almost 1 o'clock in the morning now. This was the best time for a sneak attack. Chapter 267. Soren returned to the beginning. At this time the gap between the Drow warriors and the elite pirates could be seen. In terms of strength, the difference between the two sides was not very big, but after more than an hour of waiting, the difference in discipline between the two sides was obvious. The Drow warriors were still silent, but they would wipe their weapons from time to time. However, the elite pirates were a little restless. Many unruly pirates were a little impatient. If it were not for Soren's prestige and the suppression of the pirate leaders, they would have begun to stir. The discipline of the two sides was not at the same level at all. The former reminded Soren of the years in the Underdark. At that time he deeply experienced the cruel rule of the Drow and the strict discipline of the Drow army. However, the pirates were all elites, and they were a little impatient after waiting for more than an hour. They were completely used to being undisciplined. Soren saw the situation in front of him and immediately had the intention to train them well in the future. Let's go. With the appearance of Soren, the pirates immediately seemed to have found their backbone, and the restless elite pirates also settled down. When he gave the order to move forward, the others immediately began to approach the indigenous tribe. Vivian blessed herself with fly and invisibility, and flew directly to the front of the team. He did not know how the little girl's strength increased so much. Soren was very envious of her. She had been sleeping every day recently, but her flying and casting skills were so smooth. On the other hand, Soren could not master any other casting skills except for the ability to control spells. The Drow warriors were still quite quiet and followed the team in silence. The pirates, on the other hand, made some noise from time to time, and complained in a low voice because of the bad road, but they were immediately reprimanded by the leaders. Darkblade shook his head. He did not have much hope for today's battle. In fact, he had already planned to retreat if the situation went wrong. After all, there were not many warriors in the tribe. The elite and precious Drow warriors should not be wasted here. Now he only hoped that they could succeed in their sneak attack, and that Sir Throatcutter could also kill the spirits. The distance was getting closer and closer. With a glimmer of light in front of them, Vivian gradually lowered her altitude. The pirates were a little better. After all, they had seen the little girl fly and cast spells before, but the Drows were a little scared. He felt that the little girl in front of him had unfathomable strength. She had already cast several spells in a row. Haste. The first spell was Haste, which was a group buff spell. It could increase the speed of people within a certain range. Vivian could buff about 20 people at a time, so she only used it 3 times in total to buff some of them. Dragon Strength. This was a spell that was meant for Soren, and it could greatly increase his combat prowess. The little girl didn't spend too many spell slots on buffs. After casting a few simple spells, she immediately began to cast a defensive spell on herself. Then she nodded at Soren. Their mission was to kill the shaman priest. They must not give the spellcaster a chance to attack. Otherwise their side would suffer great losses. Squeak. Soren easily opened the wooden fence of the indigenous tribe, and then a group of people quietly sneaked in. The guard on the watchtower had already been killed by Vivian's disintegrate, and the other was directly hit by Soren's enraged charm. Because of the buff spell, the Drow warriors entered very quickly. During this period, the inferior indigenous people on the periphery were awakened, and before they could speak, their throats were cut. There was no mercy, no sympathy. In the blink of an eye, there were more than a dozen corpses here. Don't worry about the others. Soren looked around at his men and said in a deep voice, Darkblade. You take people to attack the chief in the center of the tribe. I'll kill the shaman priest and then come back to meet you. He didn't know when the spirit would appear, so Soren could only kill the shaman priest first. His figure went directly into the shadows, and then walked toward the courtyard that he had confirmed at the beginning. Vivian's figure was flying in the air, and she had already cast greater invisibility on herself.
The two quickly approached the position of the shaman priest. On the other side, Dark Blade had already led the Drow warriors to launch a surprise attack and rushed directly to the center of the tribe. On the way, they inadvertently startled the indigenous people, but whether they were men or women, old or young, as long as they appeared in the line of sight, they were all killed. The Drows would not pity these aborigines, and the pirates had no sympathy at all. Along the way, corpses and blood flowed. Those who wanted to resist were killed mercilessly, and soon there were nearly 100 more corpses. The Drows were close to the center of the tribe, and the noise here awakened the indigenous warriors. However, many of them were killed on the spot by the Drows who rushed in before they could pick up their weapons. It was already about 2 o'clock in the morning. Under normal circumstances, most people were sleeping soundly, and even if they heard the noise they would not react so quickly. Kill. Kill. The blood and screams finally alarmed the entire indigenous tribe, but it was a little late now. In just the first round of confrontation, the Drows with night vision had completely gained the upper hand. Although they only had about 30 people, the number of heads harvested in the battle was twice that of nearly 100 pirates. They were indeed a race that could survive in the Underdark. When they killed, they would not be soft-hearted at all. Follow me. Dark Blade felt that there was a chance of victory and immediately said in a deep voice, Rangers, follow me. Shoot those guards. Attack the big house in front of you and kill the chief of the indigenous people. The elite pirates had begun to fight with the enemies who were gradually reacting. These guys were screaming when they fought. Although their momentum was quite amazing, it also alarmed more and more indigenous people. Casualties began to appear on their own side. 7 or 8 pirates died in a while, and more than a dozen were injured to varying degrees. More than half of them directly fainted. However, the casualties of the Drows were very small. Only 3 of them were injured, and no one died because they had night vision and were more adapted to the current combat environment than the indigenous people. Blood flowed. The indigenous warriors were not gathered together. Although they lived in the center of the tribe, they lived in separate houses with their wives and children. Some of the half-grown children were also fighting, and they even killed 1 or 2 pirates. Dark Blade's expression was indifferent. He raised his hand and took out several throwing knives from his waist, and threw them at the indigenous children who looked at most 12 or 13 years old in front of him. The throwing knives hit the other party's chest, and the indigenous children fell directly to the ground. Then they heard the roar of an indigenous man nearby, followed by a scream. The Drows did not have any change in expression, and the pirates were still murderous. On the other side, Soren and Vivian approached the shaman's courtyard. As soon as they arrived near the courtyard, the little girl could not help but frown and whisper, "Brother, there's a strange atmosphere here. I don't like it very much." Soren was just about to say something. Suddenly, the house in front of them shook, and then a behemoth appeared in front of them. It was a huge brown bear about 5 meters long. Although it had the appearance of a brown bear, it did not have the aura of a living creature. After it appeared, it growled silently, and then rushed towards Soren, directly raising its huge bear paw. Clang, clang, clang. Soren naturally would not be hit by the enemy so easily. He dodged the attack and then swung his 2 swords at the huge brown bear in front of him. But to his surprise, the icing death in his right hand broke through the opponent's defense, but the curved sword in his left hand seemed to have hit some kind of tough energy field, and it was deflected to another place, causing almost no damage. Soren's expression was serious and he said in a deep voice, "Spirit Bear." Chapter 268. Spirit Bear. It was a kind of animal spirit, mainly born from totem worship. Although its external manifestation was that of a bear, in fact, most of its spirits were composed of the souls of intelligent creatures. They belonged to the half-energy life form, somewhat similar to the form of a saint, but not as powerful as the saint form. The one in front of Soren was a spirit bear totem. The indigenous people liked to worship some fierce beasts, or it may be because their ancestors had interacted with some beasts, and then they believed in a certain kind of beast as a totem. The most common totems were wolves, bears, tigers, eagles, snakes, and so on. Soren didn't know much about totem worship, but he knew that there was a kind of indigenous tribe whose totem worship must not be provoked easily, and that was the tribe that worshipped insects as their totem worship. This kind of indigenous tribe was quite difficult to deal with. Perhaps there were not many of them and their strength did not seem to be too strong, but in fact, the danger was higher than many indigenous tribes with tens of thousands of people. Many legendary professions had fallen in their hands. Dang dang dang. The spirit bear in front of him was huge, and naturally gave Soren enough opportunities to attack, but the grade 1 rare curved sword in his hand seemed to be unable to do any damage to the spirit bear. Only the legendary curved sword could break the strange energy field of the enemy. The opponent was a half-energy life form, and almost had no fatal points, and was immune to any backstab attacks. The only thing that could work on them was heavy damage, but any heavy damage could not trigger the test of death. Vivian. Soren twisted and rolled to avoid the huge bear paw that had set off a gust of wind, and said in a deep voice, "You go and deal with the shaman first. I'll hold off this spirit bear." He didn't know how strong the spirit bear was. Its paw could set off a gust of wind, and it made Soren feel like he was dealing with a 1,000-year-old black bear in Eastern mythology. But even if the bear spirit in front of him seemed to be quite difficult to deal with, Soren was most afraid of the shaman who did not show up in the house. His long combat experience made him understand how much a spellcaster could change the situation in a battle, so the first thought in his mind was to let Vivian deal with the shaman. Even if the opponent's profession level might not reach level 15. Vivian had always obeyed Soren's words, so she didn't think too much about it. She raised her hand and threw a fireball at the door, causing half of the wall to collapse. Vivian continuously buffed herself with several defensive spells, and then cautiously flew in. The enemy seemed very cunning. From start to finish, the shaman priest didn't show himself. However, the little girl was not afraid at all because in the face of absolute strength, any strategy was useless. It was almost impossible for a legendary spellcaster to lose to a spellcaster below legendary. Bang! Soren dodged 5 consecutive attacks from the spirit bear and was finally forced into a position close to a dead end. He had no choice but to block the opponent's attack with his curved sword. Plop! Soren's figure flew out directly, and before he landed in midair, he had already spat out a mouthful of blood. His body hit the wall behind him, and directly knocked out a human-shaped dent in the earthen wall. Even with his extraordinary 21 points of constitution, at this moment, he felt that his internal organs had been turned upside down. The strength of the spirit bear was somewhat beyond Soren's estimation. It was probably more than 25 points. Just now, it had directly dealt crushing damage, causing him to enter a state of serious injury. Cough cough. Soren coughed after he landed, and a trace of blood seeped out from the corner of his mouth. The spirit bear in front of him did not hesitate at all. After it sent Soren flying with its paw, it rushed over and opened its bloody mouth to bite his head. Just the damage of a paw parry caused nearly 50 bruises on Soren's body, which was higher than the damage of being hit by other people. Soren estimated that the strength of the spirit bear could reach about 27 points, and it was very likely to be close to 30 points of strength, because the strength of each of its attacks was estimated to reach more than a ton. Evade sight. Shadow jump. Slaughter transformation. Soren's figure disappeared in an instant. His whole person escaped into the shadows, and then the huge body of the spirit bear rushed over. Because it suddenly lost its target, it could not stop the forward momentum and directly knocked down the house in front of it. At this time, Soren's figure also appeared in the distorted shadows. He only had a curved sword left in his hand. When the spirit bear's momentum could not be stopped, he suddenly stabbed the sword into the spirit bear's anus. Even if there was no fatal point, he did not believe that the whole sword would not be able to cause heavy damage to the spirit bear's anus. In fact, Soren did think too much. He stabbed the sword into the bear spirit's anus. With the increase of strength in the form of the slaughterer and the effect of Vivian's dragon strength, Soren almost stabbed the whole curved sword into the bear's anus. However, he did not feel like he had stabbed the intestines. Instead, he felt like he had stabbed into a tough muscle layer. This made Soren wonder if the spirit bear in front of him had internal organs. It looked like it only had the outline of a spirit bear's body, and there might not even be internal organs inside. Roar. Although he did not hit the heavy hit effect, Soren's attack unintentionally completely angered the spirit bear, and at the same time, it also caused a lot of damage to it. The position of the spirit bear's heavy hit was relatively special. It required the legendary ability, Expose Weakness, to accurately find it. Although Soren did not hit it, the damage was greater than other places. Pucci. Even in his slaughter form, Soren still did not dare to fight the spirit bear head-on. Because the strength of animals was far greater than that of humans, the normal slap of an ordinary brown bear would cause almost instant death to humans. An adult brown bear's front paw was enough to crush the back of a bison, and the power of the spirit bear in front of him was even more terrifying. It was estimated that in the entire outer islands, only a kind of gorilla jokingly called King Kong could compete with it in terms of strength. Knowledge, creature, variant of silverback King Kong. The sword was pulled out. Soren did not see any blood on the blade, as if there was no blood in the body of the spirit bear in front of him. With an angry roar, a huge bear paw swept across. Soren did not dare to take it head-on and could only dodge. At the same time he stretched out his palm and slapped the back of the spirit bear. Vampiric touch. The effect of the spell was still effective, and the opponent was not a demigod spirit. With the higher degree of conversion of the body's energy, in addition to being immune to any non-rare weapon attack, the spirit could also be immune to many level 1 to 3 low-grade spell attacks. This was due to the accumulation of spell resistance. If a legendary profession had high enough spell resistance, it could also offset many lower spell effects. Vampiric touch directly stole the target's life energy, so the spirit bear almost took all the damage. At the same time Soren's pale face showed a trace of blood. A very pure life energy poured into the body, and Soren's injuries recovered a lot. Shadow strike. Not daring to fight the enemy head-on, Soren could only move around. Fortunately, creatures with too much strength were more clumsy and heavy when moving. The strength of the spirit bear was estimated to be higher than many giants, but its agility was only at the level of a normal person. As long as Soren paid attention not to be blocked by it, he could consume its strength little by little. According to the calculation of the damage received by blocking, the normal attack of the spirit bear could reach about 80 points, which was equivalent to the attack of a legendary sword saint. Soren could only withstand 3 attacks from it at most. Shadow strike. The sound of magic explosion came from the house. Soren did not dare to be distracted to observe the situation over there, and could only take a look when he jumped into the air to avoid it. Vivian seemed to have encountered a little trouble, but his telepathy told Soren that the little girl was not injured, but there was some annoying trap inside. He could feel a trace of anger in the little girl's heart. Shadow Strike was a very useful combat skill. Its role was to use shadow energy to erode the target's body, which meant that it would be effective as long as there was contact. Soren's rogue was level 10, and Shadow Strike could cause an additional 10 points of shadow erosion damage as long as there was contact. Maybe this damage was nothing, but the accumulation of 10 chances per day was nearly 100 points of additional damage. Boom! There was a sudden explosion in the house, a bit like the explosion of a delayed fireball. Soren could not identify the level of the spell, but he could feel the elemental energy of the explosion. The explosion was like preparing a large amount of high explosives. The whole roof was lifted up, and then there was debris all over the sky as well as a nauseating smell that made one feel weak all over. When Soren transformed into a slaughterer he actually felt a little affected by the smell. He did not know what this thing was refined from. Shadow Strike. Soren's curved sword once again slashed the back of the spirit bear. Just as he was ready to continue to pull away from it, the spirit bear in front of him suddenly roared. Spirit Bear Battle Roar, legendary skill. The sudden appearance of this roar shocked Soren. He had a feeling of seeing stars, and there was a trace of blood oozing out of his eardrums. It felt like he was suddenly hit by the legendary lion roar. This roar formed a substantial wave of air that vibrated and spread out like ripples, causing the nearby houses to tremble. Sound wave attack. One of Soren's most hated and feared attacks. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.